The night air of Anshan was warm, threaded with the distant hum of cicadas and the faint smell of earth after a brief rain. In the humble palace of King Cambyses I, a child's cry pierced the stillness, a cry that would one day echo across continents. The midwives wrapped the newborn in linen woven with gold threads, but it was not the richness of the cloth that marked him, it was the look in his mother's eyes. Mandane, daughter of Astyages, king of Media, stared at her child as if she had seen him before in a dream or a warning, because months earlier her father, Astyages, had dreamt of her too. In that vision, he saw a vine growing from her womb, stretching far and wide, shading the whole of Asia. Startled, he called the Magi, the Median priests and dream interpreters, who told him what he feared most. Her child would one day rule in his place. Kings do not take such prophecies lightly, and so, as the infant Cyrus was born into the arms of love, he was also born into the shadow of death. That night, when word reached Ecbatana, Astyages' marble capital, he raged and trembled. His orders were swift and merciless. The baby must die. He sent his most trusted servant, Harpagus, to carry out the task. But destiny has strange ways of disguising itself. Harpagus, a man of conscience, could not bring himself to murder an innocent child. Instead, he sought out a shepherd named Mithridates, a man of the mountains, simple and quiet, whose wife had just lost her own newborn. With trembling hands, Harpagus entrusted the royal infant to him, whispering, "Raise him as your own. Say nothing. One day, perhaps the gods will forgive us both." And so, in a world where kings dined on gold and peasants drank from clay, the future ruler of Asia grew among herds and dust. The boy's name was Cyrus. His cradle was the earth, his lullaby the wind through reeds. Years slipped by like sand through fingers. In the shepherd's village, Cyrus became known as the child with the fire in his eyes. He ran barefoot across hills, chased by laughter and the shadows of goats, unburdened by his hidden bloodline. His foster mother, Spako, watched with quiet awe as he showed a strange command even among older boys, settling disputes, sharing food, leading games that mirrored battles he'd never seen. When storms rolled across the plains, he would stand in the rain until lightning flashed, eyes wide, unafraid. "The sky listens," he once told his mother. "It speaks in light." She smiled, but did not understand. The divine whisper that touched him belonged to a destiny far beyond her simple world. The valley of Anshan was a cradle of contrasts, golden light on stone hills, shadowed ravines, and endless wind-swept plains where Persia's earliest kings herded cattle rather than commanded armies. At dusk, smoke from hearths curled upward like prayers. It was in these hours that Cyrus learned the rhythm of people's lives, the patience of farmers, the songs of women at the well, the laughter of children who had little but shared everything. Though he knew nothing of palaces, he learned early what truly made a king: the power to listen, the strength to forgive, and the will to act. But destiny cannot be hidden forever. One spring morning, when Cyrus was 10 years old, the king of Media, Astyages himself, summoned his nobles to Ecbatana for a festival. Among them was Harpagus, the same man who had once defied his orders. Fate, ever watchful, began to stir. In the mountains near the city, the village boys decided to play a game. They chose Cyrus to be their king because his voice carried like a trumpet and his sense of fairness seemed older than his years. He commanded them with surprising authority, ordering one boy to be his messenger, another to be his guard, and punishing those who disobeyed. One of the boys, the son of a nobleman, refused to follow his command. Cyrus, in playful severity, ordered him to be whipped. When the boy returned home weeping, his father stormed to the palace to complain to Astyages. The king summoned the shepherd's boy to appear before him. Cyrus entered the great hall barefoot and unbowed, a curious mixture of humility and fire. The king, cloaked in purple and gold, studied the child. "Who are you?" he asked slowly. "To treat a noble son as your servant." Cyrus met his gaze without fear. "We were playing," he said, "and I was the king. I gave him orders, but he disobeyed. So I punished him, as any king should." Astyages stared at him for a long moment. There was something hauntingly familiar in the child's face, the set of his jaw, the calm in his voice. A chill crept through the room like a shadow. "Tell me," the king said, his voice tightening. "Who is your father?" Cyrus hesitated. "Mithridates the shepherd," he said at last, but the king's suspicions deepened. He ordered the boy detained and summoned Harpagus. When the two stood before him, Astyages spoke in a low, dangerous tone. "This child, this boy, he looks like me, and yet you told me he was dead. Explain yourself." Harpagus trembled as he confessed the truth, the deception, the shepherd's mercy, the child spared. For a long time, Astyages said nothing. Then, smiling with chilling calm, he said, "You have defied a king's command, but I forgive you." The forgiveness was a mask. That night, Astyages ordered a feast in Harpagus's honor. When the man arrived, he was welcomed warmly, fed and praised until, midway through the meal, the king lifted a covered dish and revealed the truth. Harpagus had eaten the flesh of his own son, slaughtered by Astyages' cruelty. Horror froze him where he sat. Astyages' voice was cold as stone. "You will live," he said. "Live to serve me and to remember." As for Cyrus, Astyages, haunted by his dream and uncertain of fate, decided not to kill the boy again. Perhaps the prophecy had already fulfilled itself in his fear. He sent Cyrus back to his parents in Persia, unaware that he was delivering destiny into the hands of those who would one day rise against him. The return to Anshan was a homecoming wrapped in revelation. Cambyses and Mandane wept to see their child alive, the secret of his survival bursting forth after a decade of silence. Mandane embraced him, whispering prayers to the old gods of the mountains. Cambyses looked at his son with both awe and concern, for he saw in Cyrus not merely a prince returned, but a storm waiting to unfold. The boy who had led games in the fields now learned of kings and bloodlines, of Persia's pride and Median arrogance. He watched his father's small court humble compared to Ecbatana's glitter, but alive with loyalty and honor. He listened to elders speak of justice, of truth, of the sacred fire that symbolized purity and divine will. In the evenings, when the lamps flickered and the air smelled of oil and dust, Cyrus would sit by the window and watch the stars. The same constellations that guided shepherds also guided kings, he thought. The difference lay not in the stars, but in how one answered their call. By the time he turned 15, his name was whispered among tribes and traders who passed through Anshan. There was something in his presence calm, yet commanding, that drew men to him. Soldiers spoke of a boy who could ride for days without rest, who shared his water with the lowest servant, and who listened more than he spoke. Even Harpagus, broken though he was, had not forgotten him. Serving still in the Median court, he began quietly to imagine a day when the prophecy might yet come true, not for vengeance, but for justice. The boy who had been spared was now becoming the man who would change the world. The shepherd's secret. The plains of Anshan stretched endlessly, a living sea of gold and dust beneath the patient sun. The boy who had once been a secret bundled in cloth now strode through that landscape with the confidence of one born to its rhythm. Yet even as he worked beside shepherds and soldiers, Cyrus carried within him the quiet knowledge that he was both of this earth and destined to rule far beyond it. The shepherds had taught him simplicity, the rhythm of days that began before dawn and ended only when the stars wheeled high above the black hills. But his heart, moulded by hardship, carried a deeper understanding. He had seen mercy in the face of those with nothing and cruelty in the halls of kings. The memory of Astyages, the grandfather who had once sought his death, was like a distant storm on the horizon. He had not forgotten. Cyrus's foster father, Mithridates, had long ago told him, the strength of the shepherd lies not in his staff, but in his patience. That lesson rooted deep within the boy's heart. He learned that to lead was to watch closely, to understand the movement of the flock, the weak, the restless, the bold, and to move as one with them. Years later, as armies replaced herds and banners replaced the sound of sheep bells, that lesson would become the foundation of his rule. In those years between childhood and kingship, Cyrus wandered between two worlds, the rugged simplicity of shepherd life and the quiet dignity of Persian nobility. His father, Cambyses, kept a modest court, and his mother, Mandane, carried the sorrow of exile from her father's empire. From them, Cyrus absorbed the gravity of responsibility, but it was in the hills and villages where he truly learned how to be human. He walked among farmers who ploughed cracked soil with hands scarred from generations of labour. He listened to women sing lullabies about vanished gods and brave ancestors. He watched traders from distant lands, Elamites, Bactrians, Armenians who passed through Anshan with stories of empires vast as dreams. From them, he learned of a world waiting beyond Persia's mountains, the gleaming wealth of Lydia, the jewelled throne of Babylon, the endless steppes of the north. Each story was a spark in the forge of his imagination. While others saw distant lands as unreachable, Cyrus saw them as promises waiting to be fulfilled. At 16, he began training among his father's soldiers. The Persian army was small, more a gathering of noble households than a standing force, but it carried the spirit of the highlands proud, loyal, and fierce. The young prince learned to draw the composite bow, to hurl the javelin, to ride bareback across rock-strewn plains until his thighs ached and his lungs burned. Yet it was not in skill that he excelled most, it was in discipline. He moved through the ranks, not as a pampered heir, but as a comrade. He shared their food, their fatigue, and their laughter. Men who served beside him came to call him brother, and even seasoned captains found themselves listening when he spoke. Cyrus possessed a strange calm. He could stand still amid chaos, his eyes steady, his breath slow, as though time itself obeyed his will. In battle exercises, he refused to humiliate weaker opponents. Instead, he lifted them up, teaching what they did wrong, making them better. His father once watched in silence as Cyrus disarmed a veteran twice his age, then helped the man back to his feet and said softly, "You are stronger than you believe. Do not let your fear serve your enemy." That was how he led, not by command, but by example. Meanwhile, far to the north in Ecbatana, Astyages ruled with a tightening hand. His palace, built of coloured tiles and gold-trimmed walls, reflected not light but anxiety. He had grown old, his dreams haunted once more by visions of a vine, its roots spreading across mountains and rivers, its leaves shimmering in sunlight. He had tried to strangle that vine once, but it had survived. The Magi whispered that the boy he had spared now lived in Anshan, strong and wise beyond his years. Fear, as it often does in the hearts of kings, turned to cruelty. Astyages grew paranoid, punishing the nobles who had once served him faithfully. Among them was Harpagus, the man he had made eat his own son. Outwardly obedient, but inwardly burning, Harpagus began to write secret letters to Persia, to those who remembered the prophecy, to those who dreamed of a new dawn. In one of those letters, carried by a trusted messenger through mountain passes, Harpagus reached out to the young prince himself. The message was simple and perilous. The time of the old lion wanes. Persia is ready. The gods favour the vine that will shade the world. When the words reached Cyrus, he said nothing for a long time. He sat beneath a cypress tree outside Anshan's walls, the letter trembling in his hands. The wind rustled the leaves like distant drums. He thought of his mother's sorrow, of his father's quiet restraint, of the people whose lives bent under Median rule. He thought of Astyages, who had sought to kill him before he could speak. And then he looked at the sky, clear and endless, and whispered, "If this is destiny, let it be mine to carry." He began to gather men quietly, without banners or noise. Farmers, hunters, craftsmen, soldiers, Persians, all swore loyalty not to a rebellion, but to an idea. Cyrus did not promise them plunder or revenge. He promised them dignity. "We fight not for wealth," he told them in secret meetings under the stars, "but so that no man must kneel before another without honor." Word spread like embers in dry grass. From mountain villages and border forts came warriors eager to follow him. Each man carried a story of injustice: tax collectors who bled them dry, governors who humiliated their women, soldiers who took their food in the name of the Median king. They came because Cyrus spoke of something few had ever heard from a prince. Mercy, he told them. A king's greatness lies not in how many fear him, but in how many trust him. And they believed. By the time Cyrus was 20, his small following had grown into an army. His father, Cambyses, though cautious, could not deny the tide rising behind his son. When emissaries from Ecbatana demanded that Persia submit more soldiers and tribute, Cambyses refused. "We serve the empire," he said, "but we are not its slaves." The Medes answered, with threats. That was when Cyrus stepped forward and said to his father, "Let me speak to them." He faced the Median envoys in the audience hall of Anshan, a room simple but dignified, its walls painted with scenes of mountains and horses. The envoys sneered at the young man who dared to meet them without bowing. Cyrus said only this, "Tell your king that the boy he sought to kill has become a man. Tell him that Persia remembers." The envoys left pale-faced, and within days, scouts brought word of Median troops gathering at the border. The shepherd's secret was now a storm. As his soldiers prepared for war, Cyrus moved among them without the distance of royalty. He shared their meals, spoke to them by name, and listened to their fears. One evening, when the campfires glowed like stars scattered across the plain, a veteran named Artaban said, "My king, we are few and they are many. The Medes have chariots and iron. We have hope." Cyrus placed a hand on his shoulder. "Hope," he said softly, "is the weapon that never dulls." Then he turned his gaze to the horizon, where distant lightning flashed. The night before his first battle, he did not sleep. He walked alone beyond the camp, into the whispering fields. The stars above were cold, ancient, and familiar. In their pattern, he saw something eternal, the quiet truth that kings rise and fall, but justice, once born, endures. When dawn came, he mounted his horse and rode before his army. There were no gold banners, no jeweled armor, only the dust of Persia and the fire of purpose. "We fight not to destroy," he called out, "but to be free. The land that bore us shall never again kneel to a tyrant." The men raised their spears, the shout rising like thunder through the valley. And with that, the shepherd's son, the hidden heir, led Persia into its first rebellion. The war began in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. The Medes, confident and well-armed, marched south, expecting swift victory. But they did not understand the people they fought. The Persians fought with the memory of generations chained beneath tribute, and under Cyrus's command, they fought as one. He used the terrain as his ally. Where the Medes advanced with chariots, he led his men into narrow passes. Where their horses faltered on rocky ground, his soldiers moved sure-footed and silent. He attacked by night, vanished by dawn, striking from shadows and vanishing like wind. Cyrus never sought glory, only momentum. When his generals urged a direct assault, he said, "Pride wins a moment, patience wins an empire." Weeks turned to months, and the Medes began to falter. Harpagus, still serving in Astyages' court, quietly ensured that confusion reigned among the Median ranks. Orders went astray, supplies failed, and discipline collapsed. It was as if the gods themselves favoured the shepherd's son. When word reached Ecbatana that Persian banners flew over Median forts, Astyages' rage was terrible. The old king gathered his remaining armies and rode to war himself. He would crush his grandson, prophecy or not. In the heat of late summer, the two forces met on the plains near Pasargadae. The air shimmered with dust and sunlight, spears gleamed like rivers of light, and the ground trembled with the weight of thousands of hooves. Before the battle, Cyrus rode to the front line, his horse restless beneath him. He looked upon his army men of every tribe, faces smeared with dust and sweat, eyes bright with faith. "Today," he said, "we stand not as rebels, but as Persians. Let the world know that we were slaves only once." Then he lowered his spear and charged. The clash was thunder itself, iron against bone, cries swallowed by wind and sand. The Medes fought fiercely, but their loyalty to Astyages wavered. Many among them had long admired Cyrus, had long dreamt of his rule. One by one, Median units began to defect mid-battle, shouting his name as they turned against their king. By sunset, the plain was strewn with banners fallen and broken. Astyages' army collapsed. The king himself was captured and brought before Cyrus. The old man's eyes were weary, not with fear but with recognition. He looked upon the grandson who now stood as conqueror and said, "The gods spoke true." Cyrus bowed his head. "You are my blood," he said quietly. "You shall not die by my hand." And so he spared Astyages, sending him into dignified exile. In that moment, Persia became more than a province, it became an empire. The shepherd's secret was no longer hidden. In the silence after victory, the sun sank behind the hills, casting long shadows over the battlefield. Cyrus stood alone for a time, the wind tugging at his cloak. The cries of war faded into the hum of evening. He thought of the life he had left behind the valley, the goats, the stars. From such humble soil had grown the vine that would shade the world, and the gods, watching from their high, silent places, knew that the age of Cyrus had begun. The king's discovery. The empire of Media had long stood as a colossus over the lands of the east. Its banners of purple and gold had flown above cities, from the Zagros to the Caspian, and its nobles had feasted in marble halls, certain that their reign would last forever. Yet in the silence after their defeat, a new name began to move across the tongues of men like a sacred whisper. Cyrus, the boy of prophecy, the shepherd's son, the one spared by destiny. What had been hidden was now revealed, and all the world began to turn toward the rising light of Persia. In the aftermath of his victory over Astyages, Cyrus stood upon a plain still scarred by battle. The smell of ash and sweat hung in the air. Around him, soldiers gathered the fallen, offering water to the wounded whether they were Persian or Median. Cyrus had forbidden the desecration of enemy bodies. They fought for their king, as we fought for our freedom, he had said before the sun rose that day. Let no man dishonour courage, even in defeat. Such mercy was rare in a world where vengeance was law, and word of it spread faster than any sword could strike. The Median nobles, broken but alive, were brought before him. They expected humiliation, perhaps death, but Cyrus greeted them with quiet dignity. He offered them the chance to serve him, not as slaves but as equals in a new realm. Many accepted, some out of fear, others from awe. For the first time, Persians and Medes stood side by side beneath one banner. The birth of an empire was not marked by blood alone, but by reconciliation. Cyrus's first act as ruler of both peoples was to release his grandfather from captivity. The old man, once so terrible in his wrath, was now silent and grey. When brought before the victor, he gazed long at him. The lines of pride and cruelty that had once hardened his face had softened into weariness. He no longer saw a rival, but a mirror of what might have been had he ruled with wisdom instead of fear. Cyrus did not speak. He simply nodded, and the guards withdrew. Astyages was given a modest estate far from court, free to live out his remaining days in peace. Thus the circle of blood was closed not by death, but by mercy. The people of Media, long accustomed to the heavy hand of Astyages, began to see in Cyrus something new. He did not seize their temples or mock their gods. He walked among their cities without the shield of intimidation. In Ecbatana, he visited the bazaars, spoke to merchants in their own tongue, and listened to their grievances. When a poor man knelt before him to beg for the return of land stolen by a noble, Cyrus ordered it restored and said only, "A kingdom's strength lies in its justice, not its jewels." The words were carried by the wind across mountains, finding their way into songs and prayers. From this union of Persia and Media, the foundations of the Achaemenid Empire began to take shape. Cyrus reorganized the governance of his lands, keeping local traditions intact while establishing a network of loyal satraps, governors chosen not for birth, but for merit. He built roads that linked the farthest valleys to the heart of his realm, so that news, soldiers, and trade might move like lifeblood through its veins. The Medes, who once ruled, now found themselves partners in something greater. Their ancient pride, tempered by the vision of a man who saw no difference between conqueror and conquered. Beyond his borders, other kings watched with unease. In the west, Croesus of Lydia, wealthy beyond measure and proud of it, saw in the Persian rise a challenge to his own dominion. In Babylon, Nabonidus pondered omens that spoke of a new ruler chosen by the gods. Even in far Egypt, rumours reached the court that a new power had risen in the east, a power that fought not merely with armies, but with ideals. Cyrus, however, did not rush to war. He spent his early years as king consolidating peace, understanding that an empire built too quickly would crumble as swiftly. He moved through his territories as a guardian more than a conqueror, ensuring that the wounds of war were healed with fairness. His camp was open to petitioners of every rank. When disputes arose between Persian and Median soldiers, he settled them not with punishment but with reason. It was said that in his presence, even the proud grew humble, for his calm was more commanding than anger. In the highlands of Anshan, he ordered the construction of a new city, Pasargadae, not as a fortress, but as a symbol. The palaces were simple in design, their columns tall and slender, their stones carved with the image of winged guardians. In the gardens, channels of water ran in measured harmony, reflecting his belief that balance was the essence of rule. Here, he brought together artisans and builders from every land he had united, allowing each to contribute something of their culture. The city became a living emblem of unity, a meeting of nations bound by respect rather than subjugation. Though young, Cyrus already carried the weight of a vision larger than the boundaries of his maps. His counselors, many of them older men, urged him to rest satisfied with what he had won. Persia was vast now, its borders touched the lands of great kings. But Cyrus felt the pull of destiny as surely as the tides feel the pull of the moon. He often walked alone at night through the quiet halls of Pasargadae, his steps echoing against marble, his thoughts carried far beyond the horizon. He saw before him not conquest for its own sake, but the creation of a world governed by order and mercy, a realm where diverse peoples could live under one law without fear. Yet even visionaries must contend with the burdens of power. The unification of Persia and Media was not without strain. Some Median nobles resented the ascendancy of a Persian king, whispering rebellion in the shadows. Others sought to exploit the old rivalries between tribes. Cyrus moved swiftly but subtly. He brought disloyal lords into his court, showering them with honours, yet keeping them within sight. He rewarded loyalty generously, making it clear that virtue was the surest path to prosperity. Those who plotted found themselves surrounded not by soldiers, but by their own isolation. In time, the murmurs faded. The name King of Anshan gave way to King of the Medes and Persians, and soon that too would prove too small a title. As years passed, trade flourished along the new roads. Caravans laden with lapis, spices, and silk crossed deserts, once haunted by bandits. Cities, once divided by suspicion, began to share in the wealth of peace. Scholars gathered in Cyrus's court, translating ancient laws and star charts. Priests from distant lands debated the meaning of the divine, and Cyrus listened without judgment. To him, every faith was a path to the same eternal truth, that power, untempered by goodness, was ruin. But peace is a fragile gift. Beyond the western mountains lay Lydia, where Cyrus, the Golden King, sat upon a throne of unimaginable wealth. His treasury brimmed with the tribute of nations, his pride as dazzling as his riches. He looked eastward with disdain toward the young Persian ruler, dismissing him as a shepherd who had stumbled upon fortune. Yet the oracles of Delphi whispered uneasily that the rising power of Cyrus was a sign of change. Croesus's curiosity would soon become ambition, and ambition would draw the two kings together on a path that would alter history itself. For now, though, Cyrus's gaze remained fixed upon his people. He walked through the fields of Pasargadae at dusk, the scent of wheat heavy in the air, the mountains glowing with the last light of day. The shepherd who had once tended flocks now tended nations. In the quiet, he could almost hear the low murmur of distant voices, those yet unborn, who would one day speak his name in reverence. The discovery of his destiny was complete. The child of prophecy had become the king of truth. He had found within himself the strength to rule without cruelty, to command without arrogance, and to love his people more than his crown. The shepherd's secret had become the empire's heart, and from that heart the world would soon beat to a new rhythm, the rhythm of Persia. The hills grew dark as the stars emerged, silver and eternal above his kingdom. He looked upward, and for a long time he simply breathed, the night cool against his skin, the silence vast and sacred. The wind moved through the cypress trees like an old friend's whisper. The boy who had been hidden had been found, and the gods, it seemed, were content. The rise against Astyages. The mountains of the Zagros rose like a wall of time, ancient and unyielding, their peaks white with the last snow of winter. Beyond them lay the lands of the Medes, the heart of an empire that once ruled from sea to desert, and beyond them a restless wind that carried the scent of revolt. It was in these shadowed passes, between Persia's rugged earth and the softer valleys of Media, that the true awakening began. Cyrus was no longer the boy of prophecy or the young prince of Anshan. He was now a king with purpose, tempered by hardship and guided by vision. His victories had brought him peace for a time, but peace was never meant to stay long in the house of a conqueror, for across the mountains, old ambitions still stirred. The Medes who had once bowed to him whispered in secret, nursing their wounds, hoping to see the restoration of their own glory. It began as a whisper in the court, a murmur that reached his ears in the quiet hours of dawn. The northern satrapies, lands loyal to the old nobility, had begun refusing tribute. Armies gathered under old Median standards. Some claimed that Astyages, long in exile, was being restored by loyal generals who refused to let Persia's dominance stand. It was rebellion disguised as remembrance, and it moved through the valleys like smoke. Cyrus did not rage. He called for no executions, no fiery decrees. Instead, he summoned his captains and advisers. Maps were spread upon the great stone table of Pasargadae, the rivers and mountains drawn in ochre and ink. "We do not destroy our brothers," he said, tracing his finger along the northern ridges. "We remind them who we are." The words became the pulse of his army. Spring came, and with it, the march. The Persian soldiers, hardened by years of unity and discipline, moved like a river of bronze and leather through the mountain passes. Their spears caught the sunlight like reeds in motion, and behind them followed the banners of Media, not as enemies now, but as allies under the same flame. The sound of their sandals against stone was steady, rhythmic, like a heartbeat that belonged to the earth itself. In the villages along their path, peasants brought them bread and water, whispering blessings to the king who had freed them from tyranny years before. They remembered the mercy he had shown, the justice he had promised. Wherever he went, the people opened their gates without resistance. The rebellion, though fierce, was not united. Its leaders bickered and hesitated, each dreaming of restoring the old throne for himself. Cyrus, patient as ever, did not rush into battle. He studied their movements, their alliances, their fears. He sent envoys, offering forgiveness to those who would lay down arms. "A rebellion cannot thrive," he said to his generals, "when its heart forgets its reason." When at last the rebels gathered on the plains north of Ecbatana, their forces outnumbered his nearly 2-1. Dust clouds rose in the distance, golden in the sunlight, carrying the smell of horses and war. But even as the Medes advanced, their resolve wavered. They were fighting not against a stranger, but against the man who had once freed them. Before the battle began, Cyrus rode before his men. His armor was simple, his cloak unadorned. He carried no jeweled scepter, no golden crown, only a plain bronze helmet and a sword etched with symbols of his people. The wind tugged at his hair, and in that moment he seemed less a king than a part of the land itself. He raised his hand, and his army fell silent. "We fight not for conquest," he said, his voice calm but resonant, "but to preserve what we built together. Let no man here fight out of hatred, for hatred blinds the soul. Fight instead for the peace we promised our children. Fight as Persians, and as men who will not see their work undone." The army answered not with cheers but with solemn nods. They understood. They were not a mob, they were a people. When the battle began, it came like thunder rolling through dry valleys. The Median cavalry charged first, their horses armoured in bronze, their war cries piercing the air. Cyrus's infantry held firm, shields locked, spears braced. The sound of impact was deafening, the clash of metal, the screams of men and animals, the dust rising in choking waves. Cyrus watched from a low ridge, his eyes never leaving the line. He saw where the Medes pressed hardest, and he moved swiftly, directing his reserves not with panic but precision. At one critical point, where a Persian flank threatened to break, he rode directly into the fray, his sword gleaming as he struck aside a charging horseman. His presence steadied the men. They fought as though the gods themselves marched beside them. Harpagus, who had once been Astyages' general and had since become Cyrus's most trusted commander, led a daring maneuver that turned the tide. Feigning retreat, his troops drew the enemy forward into a narrow ravine where the Persian archers waited on both ridges. A rain of arrows darkened the sun, and the rebel host broke into chaos. By sunset, the field was littered with broken spears and discarded shields, the banners of rebellion torn and trampled into the earth. Cyrus ordered that the surviving rebels be spared. "Let them see," he told his men, "that mercy can end what cruelty began." Many of those captured swore loyalty anew, their shame becoming the seed of devotion. The revolt dissolved not in fire but in forgiveness. When Cyrus entered Ecbatana once more, he did not come as a destroyer. The city's gates stood open, its streets lined with citizens bearing flowers and torches. They had known too many kings of iron. Now they welcomed one of light. He climbed the steps of the royal citadel, where his grandfather had once sat upon a golden throne. The great hall was silent, save for the crackle of torches. The same walls that had once echoed with Astyages' rage now held only the breath of history. Cyrus walked slowly to the throne but did not sit. He stood before it for a long moment, then turned away. "Let this remain empty," he said softly, as a reminder that power serves, not rules. The words marked the end of Median pride and the birth of something greater. The empire of the Persians and the Medes, united under a single will, a new order built not upon domination but upon balance. In the years that followed, Cyrus strengthened this unity. He established councils of governance where both Persian and Median nobles advised him, ensuring that no people would feel conquered. He standardized weights, measures, and trade, allowing distant markets to thrive in shared prosperity. He commissioned the building of new roads, linking his territories with unprecedented efficiency. Messengers, mounted on swift horses, could carry royal decrees across hundreds of miles in a matter of days. And yet, for all his might, Cyrus remained a man of humility. He lived simply, ate the same bread as his soldiers, and slept beneath the same stars when traveling. He spoke often of fate, not as a gift, but as a responsibility. The gods, he once told his scribe, lend power only to those who understand its cost. Even his enemies began to respect him. Ambassadors from distant lands came to his court, bringing tribute and seeking alliance. Traders from India brought spices and gems. From the north came iron and fine horses. The empire pulsed with new life, a living tapestry woven from countless tribes and tongues. But beneath the calm surface of prosperity, destiny continued to whisper. Cyrus's gaze began to turn westward, toward the land of gold and marble, the kingdom of Lydia, where King Croesus reigned. The Lydian ruler had watched the fall of Media with both admiration and fear. He had sent envoys to test the new Persian king, to measure his strength and his temper. Cyrus received them with courtesy, but the message between the lines was clear. Persia was rising, and nothing could halt its ascent. The rise against Astyages had ended one era and begun another. The shepherd's grandson now commanded legions, his word law across mountains and plains. Yet in the quiet of his heart, he remained that boy who had once looked up at the stars, wondering if destiny was a blessing or a burden. The heavens had answered him with silence, but in that silence he found his purpose. As summer bled into autumn, the fields of Persia turned the colour of bronze beneath the sun. The farmers harvested in peace, the merchants counted their silver, the priests tended their fires, and in Pasargadae, beneath the long shadow of his palace, Cyrus stood upon a terrace overlooking his realm. The air was warm, the light soft, the sound of wind carrying across the gardens. He thought of his people, the shepherds, the farmers, the soldiers, and of the oath he carried for them. The rebellion had not been a war for power, but a test of his soul, and from that test a king had been born. He looked toward the distant horizon, where the sun melted into crimson haze over the western hills, and he knew that his journey had only begun. The rise against Astyages was over. The rise of the empire had begun, the birth of an empire. The land lay quiet in the wake of war. From the foothills of Elam to the grassy plains of Media, the banners of rebellion had been lowered, and the world now looked toward one man. In the silence that followed battle, a kingdom had become something more. The dust of Persia settled into the folds of history, and from it rose the first shape of an empire. The Achaemenid realm, vast yet still young, carried upon the will of Cyrus the Great. He stood at dawn upon the terraces of Pasargadae, his capital in the heart of Persia, watching the first light spill across the gardens he had commanded to be built. The water channels ran like veins of silver through green lawns, lined with cypress and pomegranate trees. The stones beneath his feet were smooth from the labour of craftsmen who had come from every land he had conquered: Lydian masons, Median sculptors, Elamite carvers. He had ordered that no slave be used in the building of his city. All men would work for wages and rest by right. In this, Pasargadae became the mirror of his dream, a kingdom not of oppression, but of unity. Beneath the glow of morning, the world seemed vast and filled with promise. The air smelled of wet soil and cedar, and birds traced slow spirals above the domes and columns. Cyrus's cloak fluttered in the soft wind as he gazed toward the horizon, where his armies would soon march again. The union of Media and Persia had given him strength, but the empire he envisioned reached far beyond those mountains. It would stretch west to the Aegean, east to the Indus, and south to the deserts of Arabia. He did not seek to conquer for vanity. In his eyes, conquest was the instrument of peace, the gathering of divided peoples under a single harmony of law and mercy. The old world, broken by endless rivalries of kings, would give way to a new order, the Empire of Light. The years following the rebellion were years of transformation. Cyrus began the careful work of weaving his territories into one whole. He respected the traditions of every people who came under his rule, demanding not their gods, but their loyalty. To the Medes, he granted places of honor in government. To the Elamites, the right to keep their temples and rituals. To the Persians, the pride of leadership tempered with humility. He established a new system of governance unlike anything the ancient world had known. Instead of kings ruling through terror, Cyrus appointed satraps, governors who ruled in his name, bound by law and by duty. They were free to govern according to their people's customs, but were watched by royal inspectors who reported directly to the king. The system was not tyranny, it was order. And within that order, peace began to grow. Roads spread across his territories like roots of a great tree. Fortresses were built not to oppress, but to protect traders and travelers. Markets flourished where once there had been ruins. From Babylon to Sardis, caravans began to move again, bearing silks, metals, incense, and grain. The wealth of the empire flowed like water through a single body. In Pasargadae, artisans worked day and night on great stone reliefs that told the story of this new world. They carved the image of the king in robes flowing like waves, standing before winged guardians, his hand raised in peace. Beneath the image was inscribed a simple phrase in Old Persian: "I am Cyrus, king of the world, king of the four quarters." Yet for all his majesty, Cyrus refused to live in isolation. He walked among his people without fear. He listened to their petitions himself, sometimes for hours beneath the colonnades of his palace. When famine struck a far province, he sent grain from his personal stores. When soldiers returned from distant campaigns, he greeted them not with ceremony but with open arms. To the poorest, he was more than a ruler, he was the guardian of justice, the shepherd who remembered the dust from which he came. At night, the palace quieted. The scent of oil lamps and jasmine drifted through the corridors, and Cyrus often walked alone. His mind turned to the future. He did not sleep easily. The burden of empire was heavy, and the more he gained, the greater his awareness of its fragility. He understood that kingdoms built on fear crumble in a generation, but those built on justice endure as long as memory. He began to codify laws that blended the customs of many peoples: Persian discipline, Median wisdom, Elamite ritual, Babylonian precision. From this union came the first foundations of imperial law: the equality of subject peoples before the throne, the protection of temples, the sanctity of oaths, and the freedom of worship. Let each nation, he decreed, honor the gods it has known, for the heavens are vast, and the divine speaks in many tongues. The Persian nobles, once skeptical of his lenience, grew to understand its power. They saw that conquered lands, treated with dignity, produced loyalty rather than rebellion. His empire expanded not only through battle, but through admiration. Ambassadors from distant lands came to swear friendship. The nomads of the east, once raiders, now served as scouts. The cities of Mesopotamia began to send him tribute voluntarily, their merchants eager for the stability his rule provided. Yet, there were still those who doubted that peace could last. Among them was Croesus, king of Lydia, whose realm of gold and marble stood proud along the Aegean Sea. Croesus was the richest man on earth, his palace lined with electrum and ivory, his soldiers clad in bronze and scarlet. He ruled from Sardis, a city of music and fragrance, where philosophers spoke of fortune and fate as though they were one. When he heard of Cyrus's rise, he laughed. "A shepherd," he said, "has gathered the hills. Let him try the plains of kings." But prophecy had its way even among skeptics. The oracle of Delphi, when consulted by Croesus, gave him a riddle. If you cross the river Halys, you will destroy a great empire. The king, proud and certain, believed it meant Persia. He gathered his armies, his horses gleaming in gold harness, and prepared for war. In Pasargadae, news of Lydia's threat arrived with the chill of early winter. Cyrus met it calmly. To his generals he said, "The wealthy often mistake comfort for strength." He began to prepare, not only with weapons, but with patience. Scouts were sent westward, diplomats dispatched to neighbouring lands. The empire moved like a living creature, its limbs gathering, its breath steady. Before the campaign began, Cyrus spent a night alone in prayer. In the sacred enclosure of Pasargadae, where the eternal flame burned, he knelt and offered incense. He prayed not for victory, but for clarity, that he might rule with wisdom even when war demanded blood. The firelight flickered across his face, tracing the lines of a man both weary and resolute. When dawn came, he rose and said simply to his attendants, "The time has come to carry the peace of Persia beyond its borders." The army he led westward was unlike any the world had seen. It was not composed solely of Persians, but of men from every corner of his realm: Medes, Elamites, Armenians, Bactrians, and Scythian horsemen. Each carried his own banner, yet all marched beneath the same sky, bound by a loyalty greater than tribe or tongue. Their journey across the empire was long and harsh. They crossed plains where the wind sang like a ghost, and mountains where snow cut like knives. But discipline never broke. The men followed their king with reverence, for he asked of them nothing he would not endure himself. When food grew scarce, Cyrus ate what they ate. When storms drenched their campfires, he slept in the mud beside them. To his soldiers, this was not a ruler born of luxury, but one of them a leader chosen by the gods and proven by the earth. At night, the campfires stretched across the hills like constellations. The soldiers told stories of their homes, their wives, their gods, and of the boy who had been hidden among shepherds. The older veterans would say quietly, "The world has had many kings, but only one who remembers the taste of dust," and in that remembrance lay the heart of his empire. As winter deepened, Cyrus reached the frontier of his world, the great river Halys, that divided Persia's growing dominion from the kingdom of Lydia. Beyond its waters lay Croesus's armies, shining like the sun upon the plain. Between them flowed the current of fate, cold and relentless. The Persians camped along the banks, their fires reflecting in the rippling dark. In the silence of night, Cyrus stood at the edge of the river, listening to its voice. It was the same sound that had whispered to him as a child among the reeds of Anshan, the voice of destiny, steady and indifferent. The world was vast, but the human will, he thought, could be greater still. Behind him, an empire waited. Ahead, another dreamed of its own immortality. Between them, the river ran on, unknowing and eternal. The birth of an empire was not marked by crowns or thrones, but by a single man standing between worlds, ready to bridge them with courage. March toward Lydia. The winter sky over the Halys River was pale and heavy. A vast grey sheet stretched across the world. Below it, the Persian army moved with deliberate rhythm, thousands of soldiers advancing westward across frozen plains, their armour muted beneath cloaks of wool and felt. The hooves of horses cracked the frost. The breath of men rose like smoke. They marched toward Lydia, the kingdom of gold, where the richest ruler alive awaited them behind walls as strong as mountains. Cyrus rode at the head of his columns, his face hidden beneath a hood of dark leather, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He had no illusions about the challenge before him. Croesus of Lydia was no fool. His kingdom was prosperous and ancient, its capital, Sardis, resting on a hill like a crown of marble and cedar. Its vaults overflowed with treasures, its soldiers trained in the discipline of the Greeks. Lydia's wealth had made it arrogant, but also strong. Yet Cyrus did not fear wealth. He had seen how easily gold blinds men to the truth of power, that courage, loyalty, and purpose are metals far rarer than coin. As the Persian banners snapped in the wind, he thought not of plunder, but of principle. Lydia would not be conquered for greed. It would be taken so that the empire might be whole, a bridge from the mountains of Persia to the sea. The campaign began in silence. Cyrus crossed the Halys by cunning rather than brute force. The river, swollen with winter melt, was impassable for days. Croesus had assumed no army would dare attempt a crossing before spring, but Cyrus's engineers, skilled in the arts of Elam and Babylon, diverted the river's course into trenches, lowering its level until men could wade through. One morning, as frost glittered upon the reeds, the Persians marched directly through the water, their spears glinting like 1,000 needles. When the Lydian scouts saw this, they fled in disbelief to their king. Croesus received the news with laughter. "So the shepherd dares the storm," he said. "Let him come, we shall shear him." His confidence was absolute, bolstered by the oracle's cryptic promise that crossing the river would destroy a great empire. What he did not see, what no king blinded by gold can ever see, was that it might be his own. Cyrus advanced methodically, avoiding open confrontation until the terrain favoured him. He let the Lydians believe they led the dance, drawing them farther east, away from their secure walls. When at last Croesus gathered his full army on the plains near Perea, the two forces met beneath a burning winter sun. The Lydians stood glittering in the light, thousands of armoured horsemen, their spears long and their shields painted with lions. The Persians, by contrast, appeared humble, lighter armour, fewer chariots, but disciplined ranks and fierce purpose. At dawn, the battle began. Arrows cut the air in shrieking arcs, the dust of the plains rising into a golden haze. The Lydian cavalry, heavy and unstoppable, charged the Persian centre. The earth shook beneath their hooves. But Cyrus had foreseen this. His soldiers opened their ranks, drawing the enemy inward. Hidden among the gaps were lines of archers and javelin throwers who rained death upon the advancing horsemen. By midday, the battle had turned into chaos. The Persians held their ground, but the Lydians did not break. As the sun dipped low, both armies withdrew, bloodied and exhausted, the field strewn with shattered spears and fallen standards. It was a stalemate, but to Cyrus, stalemate was enough. He knew that Croesus believed victory partial was victory complete. That night, as fires flickered across the plain, Cyrus's scouts reported that the Lydians were withdrawing to Sardis. Croesus, thinking the season's campaign over, had disbanded his foreign allies and sent his mercenaries home. He would wait out the winter behind his walls and gather strength in spring. Cyrus saw his chance. He did not rest. While the Lydians celebrated their escape, the Persians marched, through snow, through darkness, through the dead of winter when no king would think to wage war. Cyrus moved like the wind that whispers between seasons. The march to Sardis became legend. His soldiers, though hungry and frozen, followed him without hesitation. They trusted his silence more than another's speeches. In their hearts they carried a certainty that no cold could weaken a faith in the man who had never failed them, who had turned every hardship into triumph. After 10 days of relentless advance, the spires of Sardis came into view, white walls glistening against the grey sky, the golden roofs of Croesus's palaces gleaming like a mirage. The city seemed untouchable, guarded by cliffs and confidence. Yet even the strongest fortress is only as unyielding as the hearts that defend it. Cyrus encamped on the plain below, surveying the walls. They rose sheer and smooth, the cliffs behind them nearly vertical. His generals murmured doubts. "No army can breach that," one said. "We should wait until spring and starve them out." But Cyrus understood time differently. "A city that believes itself safe," he said quietly, "has already begun to fall." For days he studied the terrain, riding along the base of the cliffs, speaking little. It was during one such ride that a Persian soldier, an ordinary man named Hieroades, noticed something strange. A Lydian guard atop the cliffs dropped his helmet, which tumbled down the slope. Carelessly, the man climbed down to retrieve it, revealing a hidden path only the most agile could climb. When Hieroades reported this, Cyrus saw opportunity where others saw impossibility. Under cover of night, he ordered a small unit of his best climbers to ascend the same path. They moved silently, gripping roots and ledges slick with frost. By dawn, they had reached the top, surprising the sentries who never expected an attack from that side. Soon the gates below were thrown open from within, and the Persian army poured into Sardis like a rising tide. The city fell not with flames but with shock. Croesus, stunned, fled into his palace as chaos rippled through the streets. The clatter of swords faded, replaced by the distant ringing of temple bells. By noon, the city that had mocked Persia now stood beneath its banner. Cyrus entered Sardis on horseback, his face calm, his soldiers orderly. He forbade looting and declared the lives of all civilians protected. The people, bewildered, watched in silence as the conqueror of the East rode through streets once paved with arrogance. The scent of burned incense lingered in the air, mingled with the cold breath of winter. Croesus was captured soon after. The once mighty king, wrapped in purple but stripped of pride, was brought before Cyrus. The hall was still, the fire in the brazier crackling softly. Croesus bowed his head, expecting humiliation. But Cyrus's eyes held neither cruelty nor triumph. "Wealth is a fine servant," he said at last, "but a dangerous master." He ordered that Croesus's life be spared and that he be treated as a guest, not a prisoner. Legend says that when Croesus, despairing, prayed to the god Apollo for mercy, a sudden rain extinguished the pyre upon which he had been placed. Cyrus, seeing this as a sign of divine favour, freed him entirely, keeping him thereafter as an advisor. Whether myth or truth, the act reflected the spirit of the man who had come not to destroy kings, but to teach them. With Lydia subdued, Cyrus's empire now reached the Aegean. The cities of Ionia, Greek colonies along the coast, sent envoys of submission, preferring alliance to ruin. Trade routes opened like veins through the heart of Asia Minor. From the ports of Ephesus and Smyrna came goods bound for distant lands, fine textiles, olive oil, and carved marble. The world began to understand that Persia was no longer a distant kingdom, but the new axis of civilization. Cyrus appointed governors over the conquered territories, but left local customs intact. The temples of Artemis and the shrines of the Lydian gods were not desecrated. Their priests continued their rites. Where other conquerors would have built monuments to their own power, Cyrus built trust. His empire was held together not by fear, but by faith in his fairness. As spring thawed the land, Cyrus returned to Pasargadae. The road home wound through valleys carpeted with wild flowers and the scent of thawing earth. Along the way, peasants and craftsmen came out to greet him, bringing gifts of bread and fruit. To them, he was more than a conqueror. He was the shepherd who had returned from the mountains bearing peace. That night, as stars shimmered over the palace gardens, Cyrus walked alone beside the channels of water he had once designed. The moonlight caught the ripples, making them shimmer like mercury. He thought of the cities that now lay under his banner, of the soldiers buried beneath foreign soil, of Croesus, once his enemy, now his advisor. The cost of empire was written in both glory and grief. In the stillness, he whispered a quiet vow to the wind, that his empire would never become the kind he had overthrown, that where others ruled by fear, he would rule by law and mercy, that the power given to him by the gods would serve not his vanity, but the peace of the world. The wind moved through the cypress trees, carrying the scent of distant rain. The night was deep and gentle, and somewhere beyond the horizon, the empire of Cyrus stretched farther than even he could see. The march toward Lydia had ended, but the march of destiny had only begun. The fall of Sardis. Morning broke over Sardis with the colour of molten bronze. The air was heavy with the scent of cedar smoke and cold stone, the residue of battle lingering like the last echo of thunder after a storm. From the hilltop citadel, the city stretched downward in terraces of marble, gold, and ruin. Once the beating heart of Lydia's wealth, Sardis now stood in humbled silence beneath Persian banners that rippled softly in the dawn breeze. Cyrus watched the light rise over his newest conquest from the steps of Croesus's palace. The sun touched the domes and colonnades below, revealing streets crowded not with soldiers, but with citizens returning cautiously to their homes. Dogs barked in the distance, merchants rolled open the shutters of their ruined stalls, and children watched from doorways as Persian guards passed by, not pillaging, but patrolling. No fires burned. No looting had been permitted. For the first time in memory, a captured city stood intact. The silence was the kind that follows transformation, not destruction. Cyrus descended the palace steps, his cloak dragging dust along the marble. His officers followed but kept distance. He moved like a man between worlds, half ruler, half pilgrim. At the bottom of the steps, the golden doors of the Lydian treasury stood ajar. Inside, piles of coin gleamed like captive sunlight. The wealth of generations, the hoarded vanity of kings, lay heaped before him. He paused at the threshold, the light reflecting across his face, and then turned away. "Seal it," he ordered simply. "It belongs now to the Empire, not to me." The guards bowed and obeyed. Cyrus left the palace behind and walked into the city. He passed temples where priests stood uncertain, unsure whether to fear or to worship him. He told them their gods would remain untouched. To one trembling elder, who asked whether the Persians would impose their own faith, Cyrus answered only, "The heavens are wide. There is room enough for every name spoken to the divine." It was a strange kind of conquest, gentle yet absolute. In the days that followed, order was restored with the precision of a sculptor's hand. Persian engineers repaired the city's walls, artisans returned to their workshops, and the markets reopened beneath the shadow of new law. Croesus, spared by the mercy of his conqueror, remained within the palace as an honoured guest. His attendants still served him, though his voice now carried no command. At dusk, he often stood upon the terrace overlooking the valley, the air cool against his aging skin. Cyrus sometimes joined him there, the two kings, one fallen, one ascendant, watching the slow crimson fade of the Lydian sunset. For a time they would say nothing. The hush between them carried more truth than words could. Croesus had once been the richest man in the world. His hands, adorned with rings of ivory and gold, trembled as he turned them in the fading light. "Gold," he murmured once, not to anyone in particular. "It warms the hand but chills the soul." Cyrus did not reply. He understood. He saw in the defeated king a reflection of what any ruler might become if blinded by possession, the hollow shell of greatness without purpose. Mercy had not been a gift to Croesus. It was a lesson to himself. The capture of Sardis sent shockwaves through the world. Messengers rode in all directions, bearing tidings of Lydia's fall. From the Aegean coast to the plains of Babylon, rulers and merchants alike whispered the same name. Cyrus of Persia, no longer a provincial prince, but master of the richest lands under the sun. Yet Cyrus himself took no time to revel in glory. He remained in Sardis only long enough to secure the stability of the region. He appointed satraps to govern in his stead, men chosen for integrity rather than lineage. The Lydian soldiers who had surrendered were allowed to return to their families. Those who wished to serve under the Persian banner were welcomed, their armour repainted with the colours of the empire. Cyrus believed in transforming enemies into allies, not corpses into monuments. He knew the permanence of peace lay not in domination, but in inclusion. His rule was not a cage, it was a hearth. At night, fires burned softly across the plain. Persian soldiers sat with Lydian artisans and Greek mercenaries, sharing bread, songs, and silence. Languages mingled, cultures intertwined. Out of the ashes of conquest, something new began to take form, a civilization that would not destroy what it conquered, but would absorb, preserve, and expand it. Beyond Sardis, the Ionian cities trembled. Ephesus, Miletus, and Smyrna, proud Greek colonies along the coast, debated resistance. They had long paid tribute to Lydia, and now they faced a new master. Their emissaries came bearing cautious gifts, olive branches, and gold. They expected threats, demands, perhaps enslavement. Instead, Cyrus listened as they spoke of their trade, their gods, their fears. He told them their autonomy would remain if they respected Persian law and peace. They could keep their councils, their temples, their customs. All he required was loyalty. When they left, stunned by the simplicity of his offer, one Greek historian among them wrote, "Never has the world seen a conqueror so unwilling to conquer the hearts of men by fear." Word of that spread faster than armies ever could. Cities surrendered not to force, but to reputation. In the palace at Sardis, Croesus watched this transformation with weary wonder. He had ruled by opulence, by spectacle, by the conviction that wealth could bind men's loyalty, but he saw now that Cyrus bound them with fairness and restraint. One night, when they spoke quietly by the fire, Croesus said, "You have taken what I could not keep, but you have kept what I never knew how to take, the faith of men." Cyrus regarded him in silence, the flames flickering across his eyes. "Faith," he said at last, "cannot be taken. It must be earned." The old king nodded. "Then may your heirs remember what you have earned." The words hung in the still air like a prophecy. Weeks passed, and the snows began to melt from the mountain crests. Streams ran silver down the slopes, feeding the fields that stretched beyond Sardis's gates. The Persians prepared to depart, their work complete. Before leaving, Cyrus ascended the citadel once more. From its summit he looked down upon the city, the domes and spires bathed in the pink light of dawn, the streets humming with life again. He thought of all the cities he had seen, from Ecbatana to Pasargadae, each one different, each breathing in its own rhythm. Sardis was now part of that rhythm. Its wealth would feed the empire, but its spirit would remain its own. He took comfort in that thought. An empire, he believed, could endure only if its parts retained their colour. To strip the conquered of their identity was to strip the empire of its soul. As he stood there, the wind carried faintly the sound of a flute from somewhere in the lower quarter. It was a Lydian melody, soft and mournful, but beneath it ran something eternal, the pulse of resilience. He listened, eyes closed, and when he opened them again, the city seemed already changed. The sun rose higher. The marble walls of Sardis flared gold. For a moment, it looked as though the entire city had been forged anew from the light itself. Cyrus turned and descended the steps without a word. Behind him, the banners of Persia swayed against the sky, their deep crimson folds catching the wind. The army began its journey home soon after. The roads leading east were lined with villagers offering fruit, wine, and flowers. The conqueror who had spared their homes received their blessings instead of curses. In his wake, peace settled over the valleys. Traders followed his routes, pilgrims walked his roads, and poets began to sing his name alongside the names of gods. At the border of Lydia, he paused one final time, looking back toward the distant shimmer of Sardis beneath the sun. There was no joy of conquest in his gaze, only quiet fulfillment. He thought of Croesus, of the lesson gold had taught him, and of the empires that would rise and fall long after him. The world was wide, but justice, he realized, was wider still. He turned his horse eastward, and the column moved on, their shadows stretching long behind them. The dust rose beneath the hooves like smoke from the earth, the rhythm of the march steady as a heartbeat. When night fell, the stars appeared above the mountains, countless and cold, the same stars that had once looked down upon a boy hidden among shepherds. Now they looked down upon a king who carried the weight of nations in silence, his dream glowing in the vast dark like an ember that would not fade. In the distance, Sardis slept in peace, and thus ended the fall that was not destruction but transformation, the fall that marked not ruin but rebirth. The Babylonian dream, The desert opened before them, an endless plain of shifting gold beneath a sun that burned like hammered metal. The Persian army, vast and disciplined, advanced across the sands in slow, deliberate rhythm, an ocean of movement against the horizon. From the high dunes, the banners of the empire trailed behind them like streaks of flame, rippling in the dry wind. Ahead lay the city that was the envy of the world, Babylon, jewel of Mesopotamia, the beating heart of ancient civilization, cradle of gods and kings. Cyrus rode at the forefront, his cloak wrapped tight against the grit that filled the air. The heat pressed against his armor, but he showed no sign of fatigue. Around him, the desert shimmered, deceptive and infinite. Somewhere beyond that wavering horizon stood walls so immense that they defied imagination. Walls the Babylonians believed even heaven could not breach. He had heard stories of Babylon since his youth, tales carried by merchants and soldiers. Its ziggurats rose like mountains, its hanging gardens bloomed as if they were fragments of paradise, and its gates were inlaid with lapis and bronze. But beneath its splendor, he knew, the city rotted. Nabonidus, Babylon's king, had turned from the people and the priesthood of Marduk, leaving his son Belshazzar to rule in arrogance and neglect. The empire that had once measured the stars and written the first laws now drowned itself in excess. The temples stood hollow, the granaries thin. The gods of Babylon had grown silent, waiting for a ruler who would listen again. Cyrus did not march on Babylon for glory. He marched because history itself demanded renewal. The campaign began from the plains of Assyria. The rivers of the Tigris and Euphrates glimmered like threads of liquid glass under the morning light, marking the veins of an empire too vast for its heart. The Babylonian forces, proud but scattered, met Cyrus's vanguard near Opis, a city along the Tigris. The battle was swift and merciless. The Persians struck like lightning, coordinated and unyielding. The Babylonian soldiers, their spirit drained by years of neglect, broke beneath the discipline of Persia's formations. As their lines collapsed, the citizens of nearby towns opened their gates, welcoming the Persians as liberators rather than conquerors. The priests of Marduk, long alienated by Nabonidus's devotion to lesser gods, began to send secret messages to Cyrus. They spoke of their disillusionment, of temples fallen into decay, of a king who had abandoned his own capital for the desert. They whispered that Marduk himself had turned his favour to the ruler of the East, to the just king, the shepherd of men. Cyrus listened. In the stillness of his tent, he studied the tablets his scribes had gathered, records of Babylon's kings, the laws of Hammurabi, the hymns of Sumer, long before Abraham or Moses. He felt the pulse of civilization beneath the dust, and he understood the weight of what he was about to inherit. Babylon was not a city to be destroyed. It was a world to be preserved. By autumn, his army reached the outer canals that fed the city. The Euphrates, mighty and patient, wound through the walls themselves, dividing Babylon into two halves. The walls rose nearly 100 feet high and thick enough for chariots to ride side by side along their crest. The bronze gates gleamed in the sun, and from their towers hung banners painted with lions and winged bulls. The defenders mocked the approaching Persians. "The walls of Babylon," they cried from above, "are higher than the reach of your gods." Cyrus studied them in silence. He knew he could not storm such a fortress. He would have to think as a river thinks, quiet, relentless, finding the hidden path through stone. At night, he walked the length of his camp beneath the stars. His generals awaited his orders, their torches casting long shadows across the sand. At last he spoke. "The river is the key. The city drinks from its veins. Cut its veins, and it will sleep." He ordered engineers to dig wide trenches and canals upstream. For days, the Persians laboured without rest, their tools glinting in moonlight. Gradually, the flow of the Euphrates began to diminish. As it sank lower and lower, the massive bronze gates that guarded its entry beneath the walls stood exposed. The Babylonians, in their confidence, Left them unguarded, no enemy, they thought, could walk through a river. On the night of the attack, the sky was moonless. The Persians moved like shadows, their armor blackened, their voices hushed. They entered the riverbed, now shallow enough to wade through, and advanced toward the gates. The water lapped softly at their knees, carrying the reflection of distant torchlight from the city above. Inside Babylon, the people feasted. Belshazzar, oblivious to the danger, held a banquet in his palace, surrounded by wine and laughter. Musicians played beneath gilded ceilings as servants filled the goblets of nobles. Somewhere beyond the revelry, the priests watched the stars and whispered that Marduk had already chosen his new king. Then the sound came, the faint echo of marching feet, the rhythm of invasion hidden within the song of the river. The Persians moved through the open gates and fanned into the streets, taking guard posts before anyone could raise an alarm. The citizens awoke, not to war, but to silence, to the realization that their city had fallen without a single battle cry. By dawn, Babylon belonged to Cyrus. He entered the city on foot, not on horseback, as a gesture of reverence. The great gates of Ishtar rose before him, glazed with blue tiles and images of dragons and bulls. The smell of incense drifted from the temples, mingling with the cool breath of the river. The streets were wide and paved, lined with palms and statues of forgotten kings. Everywhere he looked, he saw the remnants of greatness, art, science, beauty, and the sadness of decline. The people watched him from the doorways, uncertain. No soldiers stormed their homes, no fires were lit. Instead, proclamations were read in every square, written in Akkadian and Elamite. Cyrus, king of the world, has entered Babylon in peace. The gods have delivered the city into his hands. The temples shall be restored, the idols returned, the captives freed. The words spread faster than fear. When the priests of Marduk brought Cyrus into the great temple of Esagila, they laid the hands of the statue upon his shoulders, symbolizing divine approval. The ceremony that had once crowned kings of Babylon now anointed a foreigner, the shepherd from Anshan, now ruler of the 4 quarters of the earth. In that moment, the prophecy of centuries found its living form. Nabonidus, the last Babylonian king, was captured without resistance. He was treated with dignity, his life spared. Belshazzar, who had mocked the gods and ignored the omens, was not found among the living. Cyrus made no spectacle of vengeance. He declared a festival instead, inviting the people to pray, to feast, to rebuild. The city came alive again. Markets reopened, temples filled with song, and the canals flowed once more under careful repair. The hanging gardens, said to have wilted under neglect, bloomed again with new water from the restored channels. Babylon had not been conquered, it had been reborn. That night, Cyrus walked alone along the riverbank. The water shimmered under torchlight, moving slowly, peacefully, as if weary from the night's work. The air smelled of oil and lotus. Behind him, the great city murmured, with life bells ringing from temples, distant laughter, the creak of wooden barges drifting down the current. He paused beside a statue of a lion devouring a man, carved centuries before he was born. The stone was worn smooth by wind and time. He placed his hand upon it, feeling the cold permanence of empire, the strange illusion that kings could shape eternity. He thought of his boyhood in Anshan, the wind across the hills, the shepherd's call, the voice of his mother whispering that destiny cannot be escaped. He thought of Astyages, of Croesus, of all the rulers who had fallen before mercy rather than might. And now, as he stood in Babylon, he felt the circle closing again. He had not merely taken a city. He had taken the mantle of civilization itself. In the months that followed, the decree of Cyrus spread across the empire. It was written upon clay and stone, etched in the languages of every nation under his rule. It proclaimed freedom to the peoples of Babylon and beyond the right to return to their homelands, to rebuild their temples, to worship their gods without fear. Among those who heard his words were the exiled Hebrews, captives of Nebuchadnezzar's wars generations before. To them, Cyrus's name would echo through scripture as the anointed of the Lord, the foreign king chosen to free them and restore their sanctuary. They would call him shepherd and deliverer, the instrument of divine will. The Babylonian dream became more than conquest, it became renewal. And so, in the heart of the world's greatest city, under stars reflected in the calm of the river, Cyrus's empire entered a new age, one not born in fire, but in forgiveness. He stood at the balcony of his Babylonian palace as night deepened, the scent of cedar and river clay thick in the air. Below him, the city glowed with lamplight, stretching into the distance like a reflection of the heavens. The dream of Babylon had not ended, it had been reborn in Persian hands, in the name of a shepherd who had learned from kings how not to be one. The wind stirred the torches, and in their wavering light, the empire of Cyrus shone vast, merciful, eternal. The river and the gate. The river still whispered through the heart of Babylon, a silver thread winding beneath the shadow of its colossal walls. It was the same river that had carried the Persians into the city, the same current that had delivered empire to the hands of one man. But now, in the quiet that followed conquest, it carried something else, the rhythm of renewal. From the high terraces of the palace, Cyrus could see the whole city sprawled below him, the wide avenues lined with palms, the markets bursting with saffron and copper and incense, the shimmering ziggurats rising into a pale morning sky. Bells rang softly from the temples, barges glided beneath bridges of stone, smoke rose in slender columns from kitchens and workshops. Babylon, which had fallen without a siege, breathed again. Cyrus had ordered no mourning, no destruction. Instead, he had decreed restoration. The walls were to be repaired where time had worn them down. The canals were to be dredged. The temples of Marduk, Ishtar, and Shamash renewed. The artisans who had fled during the rule of Nabonidus returned to their forges and looms. The priests, once silenced, sang their hymns again in the language of the gods. And through it all, the name of Cyrus was spoken not as a conqueror's curse, but as a blessing. He ruled from Babylon now, but not as the Babylonians had known kings. He held no drunken feasts, demanded no divine worship. The throne upon which he sat was unadorned, carved from dark cedar, without gold or inlay. To those who came before him with offerings, he said only, "Honor your gods as you will. I am their servant as much as yours." The Persian court in Babylon was a wonder of its own kind, a gathering of voices and colours from across the known world. Medes in crimson robes, Elamites in silver, Judeans in white linen, and Greeks in their flowing chitons all stood side by side in the great hall. Translators murmured between languages. Scribes scratched upon clay tablets in cuneiform and Aramaic. The empire had become a chorus, and Cyrus its conductor. He listened more than he spoke. When disputes arose among the satraps, he heard each side patiently, asking questions that revealed the heart of the matter. He valued wisdom over victory, justice over pride. The judges who served under him wrote of his strange ability to end conflict without humiliation. To wronged men, he gave restitution. To the arrogant, silence. To the poor, an audience. One morning, an old priest of Marduk came before him, his beard white, his robe torn in mourning. He bowed low and said, "My lord, we have seen many kings. They took our offerings, they demanded our prayers, and they left us poorer. You have taken nothing and restored all. Tell us, what do you ask in return?" Cyrus looked at the man, and his voice was quiet but firm. "Only that you remember peace when I am gone." The priest bent his head, tears streaking his dusty cheeks. "Then you are already written among the gods." Outside the palace, life flowed as it always had. Merchants from India brought spices in sealed jars of clay. Caravans from Anatolia brought tin, wool, and carved ivory. Ships from the Gulf brought pearls and dates. The empire's wealth moved like breath through its lungs. But beneath that, prosperity ran the quiet hand of order roads guarded, taxes fair, punishments rare but swift. Every decree issued from Babylon was inscribed on clay and copied 100-fold, carried by riders across deserts and mountains to the farthest provinces. In one such decree, written in the first year of his rule, Cyrus commanded the release of captives and the rebuilding of temples destroyed by war. It was a proclamation that echoed through generations, remembered not as the word of a tyrant, but as the promise of a liberator. Among those who heard of it were the Hebrew exiles, weary and scattered since the fall of Jerusalem decades before. When the decree reached them, they wept openly. It said that they might return to their homeland, rebuild their city, and restore their temple to the Lord of Heaven. They called Cyrus Messiah, the anointed of God, though he had never set foot in their land. The clay cylinder upon which this command was carved would one day be known as the first charter of human freedom, its words still legible long after the empires that followed had turned to dust. In the evenings, when the air cooled and the river reflected the stars, Cyrus walked along the canals with only a handful of guards. The city glowed with lamplight, and the murmurs of night markets drifted through the air, the sound of dice rolling, the cry of a date seller, the music of distant flutes, the fragrance of cinnamon and cedar oil lingered in the breeze. He often paused at the edge of the river, where the water lapped gently against the steps of the quay. He would watch its surface shimmer, remembering how the same river had carried his soldiers into the heart of Babylon that fateful night. The Euphrates had been his ally, his secret gate, the key to victory. And now, in peace, it became a symbol, the flowing bond between his people and the ancient civilizations they now ruled. He thought of how every empire before him had fallen: Sumer, Akkad, Assyria, Babylon. Each had sought to dominate the world by force. Each had believed itself eternal. But the river endured them all. It changed its course when needed, but it never stopped flowing. That was how Cyrus wished his empire to be, not a wall of conquest, but a river of justice, moving forward without cruelty, bending but never breaking. He turned from the water and gazed at the city skyline, the terraces of the ziggurats catching moonlight, the domes glistening faintly. Babylon no longer seemed a prize taken by war. It seemed instead a mirror of what his vision could become. Many peoples, many gods, one peace. The Persian army remained stationed along the city's edges, disciplined and silent. They did not disturb the life of Babylon. The soldiers were forbidden to enter homes without permission or to take food without payment. The city, in return, fed them willingly, respecting the strange new order that had replaced centuries of fear. Even Nabonidus, the exiled king, was given a small estate in Carmania, far to the east, where he lived quietly until his death. Cyrus saw no purpose in vengeance. To him, the defeated were already punished by the loss of pride. The empire's administration settled into motion. From Babylon, Cyrus sent letters to the governors of Media, Lydia, Egypt, and Bactria, ensuring that each province remained governed by its own customs but bound by a shared law. It was said that his scribes could translate a royal decree into 12 languages in a single night. For the first time in history, an empire stretched from the Aegean Sea to the mountains of India, and yet no rebellion stirred. The conquered lands had become collaborators in the order he built. In time, Babylon accepted him not as a foreign ruler, but as part of its own story. The temple artists carved his name beside those of Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar. Hymns were composed in his honor, blending Persian rhythm with Mesopotamian melody. The people sang of him not as a god, but as a righteous king, the shepherd of nations, chosen by Marduk to restore harmony to the world. He listened to such songs in silence, but they filled him with both pride and unease. He knew the cycle of time too well. Every empire believed its order eternal, and every empire was eventually swallowed by its own shadow. The thought haunted him, not with fear, but with melancholy. He could not escape mortality any more than he could stop the river's flow. Yet still he worked, day after day, ensuring that when his body failed, his laws would not. He wrote edicts that bound rulers to the people, forbidding the abuse of labourers, requiring fair trade and the protection of travellers. He commissioned the rebuilding of roads, connecting distant lands in threads of communication that would outlast him. His mind was always turning toward what might endure. At dusk, when the palace torches flickered and the sound of the river echoed faintly through the halls, Cyrus would look to the west, where the desert faded into shadow, and think of all that still awaited him: the mountains of the north, the steppes of the Scythians, the restless lands beyond the Oxus. The work of empire was never done, but tonight, at least, Babylon slept in peace. He stood at the same gate through which his army had entered the river gate that had been his triumph and his mercy, and laid his hand upon its cold bronze surface. The metal was smooth beneath his palm, cool against the heat of the night. He closed his eyes and listened to the murmur of the river flowing beneath. In its sound, he heard something eternal, the voice of history, whispering that the mightiest kingdoms rise not from conquest, but from understanding. And as the wind moved through the palms and across the walls, the king who had once walked barefoot among shepherds stood within the greatest city on earth, humble before the quiet power that would outlive them all, the river, the gate, and the human spirit that never ceased to seek freedom, liberator of nations. The dawn that broke over Babylon in the spring of Cyrus's second year as king was unlike any that had come before. The air was heavy with the scent of new rain and ripening grain, the sky the pale colour of hammered gold. Across the city's rooftops, banners fluttered not with symbols of conquest, but of renewal. The priests sang in the temples once more, farmers tilled the fields, and the streets swelled with the hum of life returned. Word had spread like fire across deserts and mountains. The conqueror of Babylon had not enslaved its people, nor desecrated its gods. He had freed captives, rebuilt temples, and restored honour to forgotten shrines. From the shores of the Mediterranean to the mountains of Elam, his name had become something larger than a man's. It had become a promise. Cyrus, seated in the courtyard of his palace, watched the city awaken beneath a thin veil of morning mist. His advisers stood nearby, but he did not speak. The murmur of the fountains, the soft rustle of palm leaves, and the distant calls of merchants filled the silence between them. He found comfort in that sound, the sound of peace sustained not by fear, but by trust. He knew that this was not the peace of stillness. It was the peace of life moving forward, the kind that could only exist when people were free to dream again. Soon after the fall of Babylon, emissaries from every land came bearing gifts and petitions. Egyptians in linen robes, Syrians in blue silk, Lydians bearing gold, and Greeks carrying scrolls of philosophy all crossed the great gates of Ishtar to kneel before him. Among them came the elders of a people long exiled, the Judeans, who had been carried from Jerusalem generations earlier by Nebuchadnezzar's armies. They brought no treasure, only tablets inscribed with the laments of their prophets. Their leader, a man named Sheshbazzar, bowed low before the throne and said, "We come not to beg for gold or land, but to ask that we may return to our home, the city of our fathers, and rebuild the house of our God." In Telebos, the court fell silent. The request was ancient and holy. The scribes watched as Cyrus rose from his seat and approached the elder. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but unwavering. "Your God is not foreign to me," he said. "He is the same who calls all men to justice. Go and build your temple. Let your exiles return. Let no one hinder you. For freedom belongs to every man who honours the divine." He called for scribes and dictated a decree to be carried across the empire. "Thus says Cyrus, King of the world, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem. Whosoever among his people that are of his nation, let him go up. When the decree was read aloud in the markets of Babylon, many wept openly. Some fell to their knees and praised their God. Others kissed the earth, and some stood in stunned silence, unable to believe that such mercy had come from the mouth of a conqueror. Within weeks, caravans began to gather at the city gates. Families long scattered, their belongings bound in cloth, their faces turned westward toward a homeland they had never seen but always remembered. As they departed, the people of Babylon watched and blessed them. Even the priests of Marduk whispered that the gods themselves smiled upon such justice. The road to Jerusalem was long, winding through valleys of stone and plains of sand. Cyrus sent guards to protect the travellers and ordered that supplies be given to them from the royal stores. He instructed his governors in the provinces to offer silver, livestock, and timber for the rebuilding of the temple. He even returned the sacred vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had taken from Jerusalem's sanctuary, stored for decades in Babylon's vaults. It was said that when the caravans reached the western horizon, they carried not only the hopes of one nation, but the spirit of all who had ever suffered under tyranny. Cyrus understood what few kings before him had grasped, that an empire built on fear would always tremble, but one built on freedom could endure. In Babylon, the city thrived beneath this new order. Markets brimmed with goods from every corner of the empire, lapis from Bactria, cedar from Lebanon, spices from India, and fine textiles from Sardis. The roads Cyrus had built carried not only armies but ideas. Scholars gathered in his courts to debate the movements of the stars, the laws of geometry, the origins of the soul. Babylon became a place where cultures met and learned from one another, where a man could speak to his God in his own tongue and still be heard. It was here, amid the hum of trade and learning, that Cyrus began to envision what the world could be if ruled by understanding rather than conquest. His advisors urged him to consolidate his power through spectacle, to build monuments, to carve his victories in stone. He refused. "I would rather build men than monuments," he said, "for stone falls but justice endures." Beyond the palace walls, the empire expanded like dawn spilling across the horizon. To the east, his generals subdued the rebellious tribes of the Zagros. To the north, they secured the borders of Armenia. And to the west, envoys from distant lands came bearing treaties rather than challenges. The name of Cyrus inspired not fear, but trust, a rarity in any age. He knew, however, that no peace lasted forever. There were always restless corners of the world, men who mistook mercy for weakness. Reports arrived from the steppe of fierce nomads beyond the Oxus who defied all rule. But that storm would wait, for now the king's heart was fixed upon the work of creation, not destruction. One afternoon, Cyrus walked along the gardens of Babylon with Croesus at his side. The former Lydian king had grown grey, his once proud bearing softened by humility. They passed under archways heavy with ivy, the sound of water echoing through the air. Croesus spoke first. "You have given liberty to those who were once slaves," he said. "But do you not fear what freedom breeds? Men who are free may grow ungrateful." Cyrus paused, watching a flock of white birds scatter over the river. "Gratitude is a seed that grows only in rich soil," he said. "Fear kills it. Give men freedom, and they will learn to love the hand that spared them." The older king nodded. "Then you have built something even wealth cannot buy." Cyrus smiled faintly. "It is not mine to keep. I am only its guardian." They walked on in silence, the air filled with the perfume of lotus and myrrh. In the months that followed, the returning exiles sent word back to Babylon of their progress. They spoke of stones laid upon the ruins of their old temple, of children laughing in streets once filled with ashes, of a city reborn through mercy. When the first reports reached him, Cyrus listened quietly, eyes closed. "Then the gods have done their work," he said, and ordered the messengers fed and clothed before they continued home. For him, It was not merely a triumph of policy, it was the fulfillment of something sacred. He had become the bridge between peoples, the instrument of peace in a world weary of violence. By the time the second harvest came under Persian rule, the empire had become a continent of light. From the valleys of Egypt to the gates of India, men lived under laws that treated them as subjects, not slaves. Justice travelled faster than armies. The couriers of Cyrus rode day and night, carrying edicts written in languages of many nations but bound by a single purpose, to remind every corner of the world that mercy had power greater than fear. When the festivals of New Year arrived, the priests of Babylon invited Cyrus to attend the sacred rites of Marduk. He went barefoot, wearing only a plain robe, and offered incense as the hymns rose in ancient tongues. The crowd bowed low as he left, murmuring prayers for his health and the prosperity of his reign. That night, standing alone upon the balcony of his palace, Cyrus looked out over the river's gleam and the constellation of fires beyond it. He thought of the Hebrews singing by the walls of Jerusalem, of the merchants of Sardis, of the priests of Babylon, all united beneath the same sky. He realized that empire, for all its splendor, was a fleeting thing. But the idea of freedom, once given, could never be taken back. It moved through the world like light through glass bending, refracting but never extinguished. He turned his gaze upward. The stars burned cold and silent, yet in their stillness he felt companionship. They had watched him since he was a boy, and they would watch long after he was gone. He whispered to them as one might speak to an old friend, the Empire of Light. The morning sun rose over Babylon like the slow unfurling of a golden banner. From the eastern walls, the light reached the towers and temples, the streets and courtyards, spilling over rooftops and casting the city in hues of amber and bronze. Birds circled above the ziggurats, and the smoke of morning fires wound upward like prayers. In that stillness, Babylon was more than a city. It was the heart of an empire breathing in perfect rhythm. Cyrus stood upon the balcony of his palace, his gaze sweeping the horizon. From this place, at the centre of the world, his dominion stretched farther than any before him. To the west, the Mediterranean glimmered beyond the plains of Syria and the mountains of Anatolia. To the east, the sun rose over the deserts of Persia and the high plateaus of Bactria. To the north lay Armenia and the mountains of the Medes, and to the south, the blue curve of the Persian Gulf. It was not merely a kingdom, it was a world, and yet, in that vastness, Cyrus saw not distance but connection. Roads carried messages across mountains and deserts, couriers on swift horses crossed rivers and plains, traders moved with goods and gossip, soldiers patrolled, scholars travelled to the great libraries of Babylon. The empire had become a living thing, bound not by fear but by order. The Persian system of governance was unlike any that had come before it. Cyrus had learned that a vast realm could not be ruled by one voice alone. Instead, he divided the empire into provinces, satrapies, each governed by trusted men who answered to him directly. They collected taxes, enforced justice, and maintained peace. But they ruled in harmony with local traditions. He sent inspectors, the eyes and ears of the king, to ensure fairness, but they reported not only disobedience, but also suffering. For Cyrus, an oppressed people was a weakened province. He saw unity not as the crushing of diversity, but as its orchestration. "Let every nation keep its music," he had told his council. The empire is the harmony of many songs. Under his rule, artisans from Egypt carved stone beside masons from Lydia. Babylonian engineers designed canals with the help of Persian builders. Scholars from India studied astronomy with the priests of Marduk. From this mingling of minds, the world began to change. The empire became not only a collection of lands, but a beacon of civilization, a vast constellation of cities linked by the light of shared purpose. In the heart of Pasargadae, where his reign had begun, new gardens bloomed. The air there was filled with the scent of cypress and almond blossoms, the sound of running water in marble channels. The city had grown since its humble beginnings. New halls of stone stood among flowering courtyards, the columns engraved with the image of winged guardians. But the king's residence remained modest. His bed was carved of plain cedar. His throne was unadorned. When foreign emissaries came expecting to see gold and jewels, they found instead simplicity. When one envoy from Greece remarked that such humility was unfit for the ruler of the world, Cyrus smiled faintly and said, "The weight of the crown is heavy enough without gold." 18. The empire flourished under this light. Farmers ploughed the lands of Mesopotamia under protection of law. Caravans crossed the old trade routes, once haunted by raiders. Temples rose again in cities long left in ruin. From Egypt to India, tribute poured in not as a mark of servitude, but as a pledge of allegiance. But Cyrus did not measure his success by wealth. To him, the true treasure of an empire was stability. He once told his generals, "A peaceful field yields more than a conquered city." His reputation spread beyond the borders of his rule. Philosophers in Greece spoke of him as the ideal ruler, the philosopher king. Egyptian scribes called him friend of the gods. The Hebrew prophets named him the Anointed One. In every language, his name became synonymous with justice. Though his empire shone like morning, Cyrus never forgot the darkness from which he had risen. He remembered the valleys of Anshan, the scent of dust and rain, the voices of shepherds calling their flocks. He remembered the cruelty of Astyages and the arrogance of Croesus. He carried those memories not as wounds but as warnings. He had seen how power can corrupt the spirit, how kings could mistake worship for love. He vowed his empire would never repeat those mistakes. His satraps were required to live among their people, not above them. He sent out edicts that forbade the taking of slaves from free lands. He abolished the mutilation of criminals, replacing cruelty with law. And when war was necessary, he demanded his soldiers treat even enemies with honor. It was said that no army in history marched with such discipline, and none left so little ruin in its wake. At night, when the city lights shimmered like stars reflected in the river, Cyrus often sat in his chambers, surrounded by maps and scrolls. The maps were never still. New territories were added, new borders drawn. Yet as his realm expanded, he felt a strange sense of unease. For every mountain subdued, another appeared in the distance. He began to sense that empire, no matter how righteous, was an endless task. He could govern men's bodies, but not their hearts. He could bring peace, but not contentment. The farther his reach grew, the more he understood the limits of kingship. And yet he continued, not out of vanity, but out of duty. "The gods have placed the world in my hands," he once told his son, Cambyses. "It is my burden to hold it gently." One afternoon, as the heat of the day faded, he stood beside Croesus in the gardens of Babylon. The older man leaned upon a staff of carved ivory, his face weathered, his eyes reflective. They looked upon the canals glittering beneath the sun, the boats drifting lazily with the current. "You have built an empire of light," Croesus said softly. "But even light casts a shadow. Do you not fear what comes after you?" Cyrus gazed at the water. "All things end," he said. "The question is not whether they fall, but what they leave behind. If my shadow is law, if my echo is mercy, then the fall will not matter." Croesus nodded, his voice faint. "Then you are wiser than any I have known." They walked on until the sun dipped behind the western walls, the light breaking into long golden bars across the garden pools. In the years that followed, the empire's wealth became legend. Roads stretched from Susa to Sardis, from Ecbatana to Persepolis. Couriers could carry a royal decree across 1,000 miles in mere days. The empire became the spine of the known world, every city a joint, every river a vein. and at its heart was Cyrus unwavering, compassionate, and vigilant. He continued to travel through his provinces, never allowing the distance between ruler and ruled to grow too great. In each city, he listened before he commanded. In each temple, he bowed before he spoke. In every place, he left behind the same impression, a king who ruled as though the gods themselves watched through his eyes. When he entered a conquered land, he did not trample it. He walked softly, like one who stepped upon sacred ground. As the empire matured, Cyrus's thoughts began to drift more often toward mortality. He had seen many seasons pass since the day he first rode as a boy through the hills of Anshan. The vigour of youth had softened into patience, his hair threaded now with silver, but his spirit remained unbroken. He often spoke of death not as an enemy, but as another journey. "The body falls," he said to his scribes, "but the deeds of justice walk forever." In the cool nights of Babylon, he sat beneath the open sky and felt the vastness pressing down upon him, the stars scattered like embers in the black. He understood then that his empire, great as it was but a shadow beneath that infinite vault. Yet he found comfort in the thought that he had added light to it. He had taken the fire of kingship, that cruel, consuming flame, and turned it into a lantern for all mankind. Years later, when travellers from Greece or India entered Babylon, they would stop in awe at the sight of its peace. They would ask the merchants, "Who rules here that such order reigns?" And the merchants would answer, "The shepherd of nations Cyrus the Great." They would say that his justice shone brighter than his armies, that his mercy was his crown, and that the empire he built was less of stone than of spirit. In that age, the world was still young, and tyranny had many faces. But in the reign of Cyrus, men began to believe that power could be noble, that kings could serve rather than devour. The laws he wrote, the roads he built, the freedom he granted, they were threads of gold woven through history, gleaming still when kingdoms turned to dust. The empire of light had risen from the ashes of fear, and its glow reached farther than any torch of conquest. The shadow of the north, the cold arrived first as a whisper, then as a hand tightening around the empire's throat. From the northern steppes came the wind, sharp and dry, carrying with it the scent of snow and the faintest taste of smoke. It rolled down from the unseen reaches of the Oxus, from the world beyond the known, where the horizon never ended and the grass never ceased its motion. In Pasargadae, the air turned brittle. The gardens froze, the streams stilled. The white mountains crouched in the distance, vast and indifferent. Within the quiet of the palace, Cyrus moved through the marble halls like a shadow, his footsteps soft against the stone. He had ruled for decades, long enough to see children become soldiers, rebels become governors, enemies become allies. He had brought order to chaos, peace to lands that had known only fire. Yet beyond the map's farthest edge, unrest had begun to stir. From Bactria came the first reports, small villages raided, traders slain, herds stolen beneath the pale moon. The messengers arrived, dust-choked and trembling, their words carried like sparks in dry grass. Across the northern plains, tribes were gathering. They were said to be fierce beyond reckoning, masters of horses and wind, worshippers of the open sky. Their names spread with dread across the borderlands, the Pasargadae. They moved like weather, untamed and unpredictable. No wall could hold them, no treaty could bind them. They were born to motion and hunger, and they had begun to test the borders of the world's greatest empire. In the council halls of Pasargadae, maps were unfurled, marked with ink and blood. Lines drawn in haste crossed the valleys and rivers of the north. The empire was vast, but not eternal. Its fringes blurred into the wilderness. Cyrus stood before the maps, his hands clasped behind his back. The torches flickered, and their light cut his face into plains of calm resolve. Beyond the borders, he saw more than land, he saw inevitability. Peace was never still. It had to move forward, or it was lost. Through winter's slow procession, the empire began to stir again. Messengers rode through the mountain passes, summoning men and horses, gathering the instruments of war. Smiths hammered bronze and iron in forges that burned all night. In the plains near Bactria, tents multiplied like stars, their fires dotting the earth. The army of the East, his last and greatest, grew in silence, as if the land itself were preparing to defend its heart. Cyrus left Pasargadae before the first thaw. The city faded behind him in a haze of white mist and dust. Ahead stretched the road that would carry him toward the unknown, the same kind of road that had once carried him from Anshan to Babylon, from youth to legend. The mountains closed around his column. The air thinned until each breath felt carved from ice. By night, the wind howled through the passes, and the stars burned brighter than any torch. The soldiers moved without complaint, their armour glazed with frost, their faces half hidden behind scarves of wool. In their silence was a kind of reverence. They knew they followed the man who had united half the world, who had made justice walk upon the earth like a living thing. The rivers of Bactria ran black with cold, the fords slippery with ice. Beyond them lay the grasslands, a world without walls, without end. The horizon rolled forever, blue and gold and grey, a sea of motion beneath the sun. The Persians entered it as sailors might enter an ocean, their eyes narrowing against the wind. They found the remnants of villages, smouldering fires, bones of cattle picked clean by wolves. No enemies appeared, only the endless plains and the sense of being watched. At night, the sound of hooves sometimes echoed in the distance, faint as memory. The fires in the Persian camp burned high, but the darkness beyond them was alive. The scouts returned with stories of riders glimpsed far to the north, men and women alike, clad in skins and bronze, their faces painted with ash, their bows curved like the moon. They were said to follow a queen named Immerse, who ruled by strength and example. She led her warriors from the front, her banner of crimson and gold visible even through the dust storms of the steppe. The more the Persians advanced, the more the land itself seemed to resist them. Storms gathered suddenly and vanished as quickly, leaving the grass flattened and wet. The sky changed colour without warning, from silver to violet to the yellow of bone. The horses grew restless, the men grew leaner. Still they marched. When they reached the river Araxes, the world seemed to end. Its waters ran wide and cold, slicing through the plains like a blade of moving glass. Beyond it lay the Pasargadae, the horizon of the empire, the unbroken wild. Cyrus made camp on the southern bank. The tents stretched for miles. The smoke from their fires carried eastward by the wind. The river murmured constantly, a restless voice that filled the silence between heartbeats. Days passed. No enemy appeared, only birds wheeling high above, and the faint tracks of hooves on the far shore. Then one morning, the fog lifted, and across the river, shapes appeared, horsemen, hundreds of them, their armour glinting, their banners rippling in the pale sun. At their centre rode a woman on a white horse. Her hair was bound in braids the colour of copper, her armour dark as storm clouds. The wind caught her cloak and flung it wide, crimson against the silver of the day. She did not shout. She did not raise a sword. She simply sat her horse and watched the Persians from across the water, still and sure as the land itself. The armies stared at one another for a long time, divided by the river's slow current. No arrows flew, no challenge was given, only the sound of the water between them. Then, as the sun climbed, the Pasargadae turned and rode away, vanishing into the horizon's shimmer. The next night, the Persian camp burned with unease. Men dreamed of riders circling unseen, of eyes in the grass. The firelight flickered across, faces drawn thin by cold and hunger. The vastness of the land pressed upon them like a weight. Cyrus moved among them in silence. He had no need of words. He felt the same wind, the same tension. The empire had reached its boundary not of geography, but of will. Here, in this space between civilizations, the difference between order and chaos was only a breath. He lay awake in his tent, listening to the sigh of the river beyond the canvas. It sounded like the voice of the earth itself, ancient, indifferent, eternal. The stars above the steppe burned sharp and cold, their light older than empires. He thought of the cities he had built, the laws he had written, the people who slept beneath his peace. He thought of his youth beneath the Persian sky, when the world was still small and the future endless. The river whispered on. At dawn, frost silvered the grass. The Persians rose to the sound of horns and the rustle of armour. The air was heavy, expectant. Across the water, faint trails of dust began to rise again, the sign of movement. The horizon rippled with motion, like the surface of a great sea stirred by wind. The steppe was waking. The shadow of the north had come alive. Cyrus rode to the front lines as the sun broke through the mist, the light striking his armour until he seemed for a moment carved from bronze. Before him stretched the infinite land, the threshold of the world. He had crossed deserts and mountains, conquered cities of marble and clay, tamed the fury of nations. Yet here, before this endless wilderness, he felt the old hum of destiny again, the same quiet, unstoppable current that had carried him all his life. The horses stamped, the wind hissed through the reeds, and far across the river the riders gathered in dark swarms, their spears catching the morning light. No voice called out, no messenger came. The river itself was the only sound. And in that stillness, before the battle began, the empire of man and the wilderness of gods regarded one another, waiting to see which would yield first, the law or the wind. The last campaign, the dawn rose pale and soundless over the plains beyond the Araxes. The frost shimmered across the grass like a thin veil of glass, breaking under the hooves of restless horses. The Persian camp stirred with the slow rhythm of waking breath, soldiers tightening their cloaks, fires rekindled to life, the steam of boiling grain rising into the frozen air. Above the horizon, the sky was a dull iron grey, the colour of waiting. The river ran wide and patient between two worlds. To the south, the ordered calm of empire. To the north, the boundless steppe and the tribes that refused its reach. For days, the two sides had watched each other across the current, silent and unyielding. Scouts rode out at dusk and returned before sunrise, whispering of shadows moving in the tall grass, of laughter carried by the wind. The Pasargadae were close, always close, but never still. Cyrus rose before light, as he always had. His armour, dulled by frost, clung cold to his shoulders. The years had weathered his face, but not his resolve. He stood before the river, as the sun broke through the clouds and turned the water to molten gold. The air smelled of iron and smoke, the world trembling on the edge of something vast and irreversible. He had crossed many rivers in his life, and each one had changed him. The Halys had made him a conqueror, the Euphrates had made him a liberator. The Araxes would decide what kind of man he would be remembered as. Behind him, the banners of Persia rippled winged lions, suns and stars embroidered in red and gold. The murmurs of his men rose softly, not in fear, but in the quiet acknowledgement of fate. They knew their king would not turn back. He never had. The first move came from the south. Cyrus's army crossed the Araxes at a shallow bend, the water biting against their knees. Engineers built pontoon bridges, soldiers marched in steady lines, the sun glinting off shields and helmets. The river resisted for a moment, then gave way. When the army reached the far bank, the land seemed to breathe differently, wider, harsher, untouched by law. They advanced across the steppe, leaving the shimmer of the river behind. For days, they saw nothing but endless grass and the wide dome of the sky. The wind sang across the plains like the voice of eternity. Sometimes it carried the faint thunder of hooves that never appeared. At night, fires burned in clusters. Men huddled in silence, their faces lit by the red pulse of embers. The stars stretched above them, countless and cold. Cyrus sat apart, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the darkness deepened into mystery. He had known many kinds of silence, those that came before victory, before speech, before dawn. But this silence was different. It was the sound of the unknown, the vast emptiness that no empire could tame. The Pasargadae struck at dusk. They came without trumpet or warning, rising from the grass like ghosts, their horses draped in furs, their arrows whistling in sheets of black rain. The first volley fell upon the Persian vanguard, cutting down men before they could form ranks. The plains erupted with the clash of steel and the thunder of hooves. Cyrus's commanders rallied their lines, horns blaring across the chaos. The Persians fought in disciplined ranks, their shields locked, their spears thrust forward like a wall of teeth. The Pasargadae circled them, loosing arrows from every direction, vanishing before a countercharge could reach them. The battle turned in spirals, wild and unending, as if the land itself were moving beneath them. When night fell, both sides withdrew. The steppe swallowed the sound of war, leaving only smoke and silence. By morning, the ground was dark with frost and blood. The Pasargadae had vanished again, leaving behind their dead and the echo of hooves in the distance. Cyrus walked among the fallen, his cloak dragging through the snow. The faces of his soldiers looked peaceful in death, their armour rimed with ice. He had led men into countless battles, but this one felt different, not a conquest, but a reckoning. He sensed that the steppe would not yield easily, that the sky itself had turned its gaze upon him. Still, he ordered the march to continue. Days stretched into weeks. The Persians advanced deeper into the wilderness, chasing shadows, always a step behind their elusive enemy. The cold grew sharper, the provisions thinner. The soldiers' breath hung in the air like ghosts. One night, scouts returned with word of a Pasargadae camp ahead, a great gathering of tents, fires burning in the valley beyond a ridge. The opportunity was irresistible. Cyrus ordered an attack before dawn. The Persians descended like a storm. They fell upon the camp with precision and fury, their blades flashing in the firelight. The Pasargadae fled in confusion, leaving their chieftains slain, their queen nowhere to be found. By morning, the camp was theirs. Victory, it seemed, had come at last. But as the sun rose higher, the smell of wine filled the air. The tents were lined with jars and feasting tables, meat still warm, the remains of a banquet abandoned in haste. Some soldiers laughed and began to eat. Others hesitated. Cyrus stood at the edge of the camp, watching the smoke rise. Something about the silence unsettled him. It was too clean, too deliberate. The wine gleamed dark in the cups like blood. The steppe around them was still. No birds cried, no wind stirred. Then, from the ridges, the horizon erupted. The Pasargadae returned, tens of thousands strong. The false camp had been bait, and the Persians had taken it. The sky filled with arrows, the ground trembled with the charge of horses. The earth seemed to split open beneath the storm of hooves and steel. The Persians fought bravely, their ranks holding against wave after wave. Cyrus himself rode among them, his sword flashing, his voice carrying above the roar of battle. He struck down rider after rider, his armour dark with dust and blood. But the tide was endless, and the sky had turned red. By nightfall, the battlefield was a ruin of fire and bodies. The wind blew cold across the dead, carrying the smell of ash and iron. The surviving Persians fell back toward the river, their torches dim in the gathering dark. Cyrus's horse limped beneath him, its flank cut, its breath ragged. He dismounted and stood upon the plain. Around him lay silence again, the vast, eternal silence of the north. The fires flickered low, their light barely reaching the edge of his shadow. The cold bit deep into his bones. He looked toward the stars, remembering the warmth of Babylon, the gardens of Pasargadae, the laughter of soldiers around campfires long past. He thought of the empire he had built of its roads, its laws, its mercy, and knew that even if his body fell here, its spirit would remain. The night deepened. The last of the fighting faded into echoes. He drew his cloak tighter, standing beneath the endless dome of the northern sky, the constellations burning like watchful eyes. When the dawn came, pale and cold, the plains were still. The wind moved over the grass, erasing the traces of battle, carrying them into the horizon. The shadow of the north had claimed the shepherd of the world, the queen of the steppe. The northern sun rose pale and uncertain over the battlefield. The frost clung to the bodies of the fallen, glittering like a cruel kind of beauty. The smoke of dying fires coiled upward and vanished into a sky vast enough to swallow memory. All around lay silence, the kind that exists only after the world has been remade by violence. The air was heavy with the iron scent of blood, the faint crackle of burning tents, and the slow breathing of horses too tired to run. Out of that silence came the riders of the Pasargadae, their hooves muffled by the frozen earth. They moved with the stillness of hunters, approaching a wounded animal. At their head rode Queen Immerse. Her armour gleamed faintly beneath the pale light. Fur-lined and dark, her bow slung across her back, her eyes fixed on the plain, she dismounted among the dead and walked slowly through them, her boots sinking into the cold mud. The Persians lay as they had fought, shields shattered, swords still in hand, their faces turned upward toward a sky that would never look down again. Among them, she found the man she had come to meet in war, the king who had dared to cross her river. Cyrus lay where the final charge had broken. His armour was torn, his cloak soaked dark. The hilt of his sword still rested in his hand. His face was calm, almost serene, as though he were merely resting after a long journey. The wind stirred his grey hair. Around him, his fallen guard lay in a circle, the last ring of loyalty in a life built upon it. Immerse looked down at him for a long time without speaking. The legend of Cyrus had reached even these far plains before his arrival. Stories of a man who conquered the world not with cruelty but with mercy, who freed captives instead of enslaving them, who raised cities rather than burned them. Her people had sung of him even as they sharpened their spears. Now he was a still figure on her land, as mortal as the rest. She knelt beside him. The wind tugged at her cloak, carrying the faint sound of distant crows. For the first time in her long life of battle, she felt no triumph, only a deep, aching respect for the strength of a man who had come so far and met his end without fear. The steppe stretched endlessly around them, its grass silver with frost. She stood and turned to her warriors. They waited in silence, expecting her rage, her vengeance. Instead, she raised her hand. "Enough," she said. "He sought to take what was ours, and he has paid the price. There will be no more killing. The land has taken its due." Her soldiers lowered their weapons. The wind carried her words out across the plains. As the sun climbed, the bodies of the dead were gathered into mounds. The Persians and the Pasargadae worked side by side, digging into the frozen soil. The air filled with the scraping of shovels, the low murmur of voices. The battle that had raged through the night now lay still, folded into the earth that had witnessed it. Cyrus was placed apart, at the crest of a hill overlooking the river he had crossed. His cloak was wrapped around him, his sword laid across his chest. The Pasargadae stood in a circle around the grave, their heads bowed. The queen herself placed a handful of soil upon his breast. "Let the earth keep him," she said. "He was no tyrant, but he forgot that the sky has no master." The words fell like frost into the silence. Then she turned away, leaving him to the wind and the light. For days afterward, the Pasargadae camped near the battlefield. They burned what could not be buried and tended to their wounded. The steppe was vast, but even there, the shadow of what had happened lingered. The land had absorbed too much blood to ever be the same. At night, the northern lights flickered faintly along the horizon, pale green ribbons twisting through the darkness. The elders said it was the fire of the gods, guiding the spirits of the fallen. Some said they saw a figure walking among those lights, moving slowly toward the stars, A man in simple robes, his face calm, his eyes turned eastward. When at last the Pasargadae departed, the plains swallowed every trace of them. The snow fell and covered the graves. The wind erased the tracks of horses. The river ran on, indifferent and eternal. Far to the south, in Pasargadae, word of the king's death came on the wings of winter. The messengers rode hard, their horses foaming, their faces raw from wind. When they arrived, the city fell into a silence that was not disbelief, but awe. The people of Persia had always known that such a day would come. The shepherd who had conquered the world had gone to join the gods whose justice he had served. The palace bells tolled, their sound deep and slow. Farmers left their fields and knelt beside the roads. Soldiers removed their helmets and placed them against their hearts. In Babylon, the priests of Marduk burned incense and recited prayers. In Jerusalem, the exiles who had returned to their homeland lifted their eyes toward the east and wept. Across the empire, in every tongue, one name was spoken with reverence: Cyrus. The journey home began in spring. A small escort of Persians who had survived the northern campaign carried their king's body south through snow and sand, across rivers and valleys. They moved without fanfare, guided by the stars. Wherever they passed, people came out of their homes to stand in silence. Some laid flowers, some offered bread. None dared speak. By the time they reached Pasargadae, the air had turned warm. The fields were green again, the streams full. The tomb he had built awaited him, a small house of stone on a hill, simple and eternal. Its doorway stood open to the sky. The people gathered by the thousands as the procession climbed the slope. The body was carried inside at dusk. The light of the setting sun poured through the doorway, flooding the stone chamber with gold. The soldiers laid him upon the stone bed, his sword beside him, his cloak folded beneath his head. For a moment, the chamber glowed as though lit from within. Then the sun passed below the horizon, and the world darkened. Outside, the people wept softly. The air smelled of myrrh and cedar. The torches along the hill flickered in the wind. The first stars appeared as night fell. The priests sealed the tomb with slabs of limestone, leaving a narrow opening at the top so that the light of the heavens could always touch the resting king. Across the empire, the news spread. In Babylon, they said that Marduk had called him home. In the lands of the Hebrews, they said that the Lord had gathered his anointed one to rest. In the mountains of Media, the old men whispered that the eagle had returned to the sun. No one spoke of him as defeated. Even the tribes of the north, who had brought him down, told stories of the man who had faced them without fear, who had died as he had lived calm, unbending, without cruelty. And in the long silence that followed, when the fires of war faded and the rivers ran clear again, the name of Cyrus became something larger than a king. It became an idea, a memory of what power could be when bound to mercy, of what a ruler could be when guided not by pride but by light. The years passed, and the grass grew tall over the northern plains. The river still flowed, its song unchanged. Travellers who crossed it in later generations would sometimes feel a strange stillness there, a hush in the wind, as if something unseen watched over the steppe, the tomb, and the echo. The valley of Pasargadae lay quiet beneath a sky as soft as ash. Spring had returned to Persia, bringing its slow, luminous rebirth. The almond trees were white with blossom, the air heavy with the scent of rain. The streams that once ran through the palace gardens murmured again, feeding the roots of cypress and olive. The empire he had built still breathed, though its heart now slept beneath a small stone house on a lonely hill. The tomb stood apart from the city, surrounded by fields of green. No walls enclosed it, no guards stood before it. The people came freely, merchants, soldiers, peasants, nobles, climbing the gentle slope in silence. They came barefoot, carrying flowers or small offerings, a loaf of bread, a handful of grain, a piece of polished metal, a single candle. Some knelt, some simply stood, gazing at the simple lines of the monument, its roof rising like the shelter of a shepherd's hut. Inside, the chamber was small, the air cool and still. Light entered through the narrow slit at the top, a single beam that fell across the stone bed. In its glow, the dust shimmered faintly, as though alive. Beneath that light, the remains of the king rested wrapped in linen, crowned not with jewels, but with silence. The words carved into the doorway had begun to soften with time, worn by wind and rain. "O man, I am Cyrus, who founded the empire of the Persians and was king of Asia. Do not envy me this small earth that covers my body." The visitors read them aloud in whispers. The sound carried down the hill, blending with the sigh of the wind across the fields. Even in death, he ruled by gentleness. The empire endured. Cambyses, his son, took the throne in his father's stead. The coronation was solemn and hushed. The crown rested lightly upon his head, for the memory of the one who had worn it before weighed heavier than any gold. The court still moved with the calm precision Cyrus had taught them. The roads still thrummed with caravans. The couriers still rode day and night, their messages bearing his name as though it were a living seal. The laws remained untouched. The temples still stood. The satraps still governed in the manner he had ordained. The empire that stretched from the Aegean to the Hindu Kush did not break at his passing. It held, like the breath between heartbeats. Yet, in every city, his absence lingered. In Babylon, where he had entered as a liberator, priests lit lamps each evening in his memory. In Jerusalem, the rebuilt temple stood as testament to his decree, its priests whispering prayers for the soul of the Gentile king who had freed them. In Sardis, the merchants still spoke of the day he had spared their city from ruin. And in the Far East, along the Oxus where the steppe began, even the tribes who had fought him left offerings in the grass, pieces of metal, feathers, small stones stacked like pyramids. The world remembered him not as conqueror, but as measure. Seasons passed. The earth covered the wounds of war. The plains grew green again. The rivers swelled and receded. Time, patient and relentless, began to soften the edges of the empire's glory, but not its spirit. The memory of Cyrus became the quiet center around which the world turned. His name was no longer spoken in the roar of armies or the cries of battle, but in the hush of temples and the murmur of markets. To speak his name was to speak of fairness, of law, of the possibility that power could be merciful. Stories grew around him. In the villages of Persia, children were told that he had been born of sunlight, hidden as a child among shepherds, spared by destiny itself. In Babylon, they said he was chosen by Marduk to heal the broken earth. In the lands of the Hebrews, he was remembered as the Anointed One, the servant of God. In the north, among the tribes who had defeated him, they sang that he had become part of the sky, the rider of the winds, the eternal wanderer. Each nation shaped him in its own image. Yet all agreed on one thing: the world had been gentler for his passing through it. Years later, when travellers came to Pasargadae from distant lands, they spoke of the tomb as if it were alive. On some evenings, when the sun sank behind the mountains and the valley filled with golden haze, they claimed to hear a faint sound, a whisper beneath the wind, like a voice speaking softly through the stone. No one could say what it said. Some thought it was prayer. Others said it was memory. The shepherds who grazed their flocks nearby learned to leave the hill untouched. They said that when storms swept across the plain, lightning never struck the tomb. Rain fell softly around it, as though the clouds themselves remembered his mercy. Even kings who followed long after some noble, some cruel, came to Pasargadae to stand before the small house and read the words carved above its door. They came seeking wisdom, forgiveness, or perhaps the courage to be more than rulers. None left unchanged. Time deepened its silence. Empires rose and fell. Babylon's walls crumbled. The temples of Egypt filled with sand. The names of kings vanished from memory, their monuments buried by dust. Yet Pasargadae remained, the little city of stone and garden water, with its one humble tomb standing unbroken. Centuries turned, and still the travellers came. The Greeks of Alexander's age would find it, weathered but standing. They would open the chamber and look upon the empty bed, the faded linen, the inscription still visible. The conqueror from Macedon would order the tomb restored and guards placed around it, moved not by rivalry but reverence. "Here lies Cyrus," he would say, "who taught kings how to rule." And so the echo continued, soft, enduring, unending. When the wind passed over the plains of Persia at dusk, it carried a low, steady sound, like breath upon a harp string. The farmers who worked those fields would pause, listen, and smile. They said it was the voice of the first king, wandering the air to see if his people still lived in peace. They would look toward the distant shape of the tomb, glowing faintly in the last light, and return to their work. The stars rose above it, as they always had, bright, cold, ancient, the same stars that had guided him through the mountains of Media, across the Hales, through Babylon, and into the north. The same stars that had watched him die, and the same that now watched over his rest. And in their light, the empire he had built still shimmered not in borders or banners, but in the quiet dignity of justice, in the memory of a ruler who had made peace his conquest. The tomb stood through the ages, untouched, unmoved, enduring as the idea it held, and beneath its roof, in the hush between wind and earth, lay the echo of Cyrus, the shepherd of men, the builder of harmony, the dreamer who gave law to light, the legacy of light. The centuries drifted across Persia like slow tides of dust and dawn. Empires came and went, each proclaiming eternity, each fading into the hush of sand and wind. Yet in the heart of that great land, beneath the open sky of Pasargadae, the name of Cyrus still lingered like a light that refused to go out. His city had grown quiet, its palaces softened by time, its water channels filled with reeds and lilies. The stones of the royal terraces had grown warm under the tread of countless generations. Shepherds grazed their flocks where once kings had walked, and the air still carried the faint scent of pomegranate and cedar. The tomb, weathered but whole, remained at the centre of it all, a single, small truth against the vast forgetting of history. There was no crown left upon the stone bed inside, no treasures buried in its earth. The wind passed through its doorway like breath through a reed flute, whispering softly into the hollow space. But those who came, pilgrims, travellers, scholars, felt a strange stillness there, as though the spirit of the man who had built an empire of mercy still watched from the silence. The Persians who lived centuries after his death called him Padishah-e-Koshtal, the king of the good heart. To them, his story was not history, but inheritance. He was the measure by which all rulers were judged, the mirror against which every new crown was compared. When the wise spoke of justice, they invoked his name. When the poor cried for mercy, they spoke his name like prayer. Far beyond Persia, the echo spread. In Babylon, long since fallen to ruin, his edicts were still preserved on clay. Merchants in the markets of distant Arabia recited tales of his wisdom beside the flames. Along the Aegean coast, philosophers spoke of him as the ideal monarch, one who ruled not by compulsion, but by persuasion. In Jerusalem, his name remained woven into holy text, spoken with reverence by generations unborn when his hand had signed their freedom. No other conqueror had left behind a legacy so clear of fear. His empire had outlasted his breath, but his ideas had outlasted his empire. The clay cylinder found in the ruins of Babylon, inscribed with his proclamation of tolerance, became a testament that outlived palaces, armies, dynasties. It declared that power could coexist with compassion, that faiths could flourish side by side, that men could be ruled not as property but as purpose. Long after the empires of iron and gold had turned to dust, that cylinder remained unbroken, bearing his voice in the simplest of languages, the promise that peace is not the absence of war, but the presence of justice. In the centuries that followed, kings of many nations would try to imitate his peace. Some succeeded for a season, Others fell to their own ambition, yet none erased him. Even when the great empires of Rome and Byzantium rose and fell, even when the sands buried the cities of Mesopotamia, the legend of Cyrus remained like a thread of gold woven through the fabric of time. Pilgrims came from the west to see the tomb, calling it a house of wisdom. Travellers from the east knelt before it, leaving coins or folded scrolls inscribed with prayers. Children ran in the fields nearby, unaware that they played upon the heart of the first great empire that had called itself human. In the evenings, as the sun descended over the hills, its light touched the tomb until it glowed softly, a warm ember against the cooling valley. The shepherds said it was the soul of Cyrus burning quietly in the stone, reminding the living that no empire built on cruelty could endure the night. In the courts of later kings, his story became a lesson whispered to heirs. When princes were taught to rule, the sages would tell them of Cyrus, the ruler who slept on earth instead of gold, who called his enemies brothers, who wept for the fallen of both sides. They told how he had refused to let monuments be built in his honour, saying, "A man's deeds are his monument, the rest is dust." The young listened, but few understood. They inherited his lands, his wealth, his laws, but not his restraint. Some believed the age of such rulers had ended. Others dreamed that one day it would return. The empire changed hands, names, and borders. The stone roads cracked, the canals dried, yet the foundation of his idea endured beneath the shifting sands, the belief that order and mercy could coexist, that power could be the servant of peace. One day, long after even his language had faded from daily use, a traveller stood before the tomb. He was not Persian, but he had read of Cyrus in the ancient texts, in the languages of scholars who came after. He climbed the hill in silence as the wind swept across the plain. The tomb stood exactly as the old writings described, 6 stone steps, a small chamber, open to the sky. He approached the inscription, its letters softened by time. He could not read them, yet he knew what they said. The same words had been translated into 1,000 tongues. He placed his hand upon the stone and bowed his head. The surface was warm under his palm, as if it still held the echo of sunlight, or something deeper, something human. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "You lived like a man, but they remember you like light." The wind carried his words away, folding them into its endless wandering. The centuries marched on. Kingdoms rose and fell like the turning of seasons. The tomb remained. Rain darkened its stones. Sunlight bleached them again. The earth trembled at times, but the structure never crumbled. The gods of Babylon turned to myth. The tongues of Persia changed, but the small house on the hill continued to greet the dawn, and through all those changes, the same lesson waited in the silence between its stones. It spoke not of conquest, but of balance. It said that a ruler's greatness lies not in how much he takes, but in how gently he holds what he has given. It said that mercy is stronger than fear, that justice is not born of punishment, but of understanding. The people who lived in its shadow, generation after generation, learned to see it not as a grave, but as a reminder. For every child born in Persia grew up beneath the legend of a king who had once made the world less cruel. At night, when the stars emerged and the wind hummed softly through the reeds, the tomb seemed to awaken. Its outline glowed faintly beneath the silver of the moon. The shepherds said that if one stood very still, one could hear a faint murmur, a low rhythm, like the sound of a heart beating within stone. They said it was the breath of Cyrus, still guarding his land, still whispering to the wind. And the wind, eternal companion of empires and dust, carried his whisper across mountains and deserts, across ruins and cities yet unborn. That kings come and go, but goodness remains. That the only empire time cannot erase is the one built upon compassion. That light, once kindled, never dies. The immortal king. The valley of Pasargadae woke each day beneath the same sun that had once shone on Cyrus's reign. Time flowed across its hills like an invisible river, washing away the faces of men, the names of dynasties, the banners of 100 wars, but the tomb endured. It watched centuries pass as a mountain watches clouds, unchanging, unmoved, eternal. Grass grew thick along the terraces, where palaces once stood. The carved columns had fallen, their capitals half buried in earth. The voices of the old court, the scholars, soldiers, and poets who had filled its halls had long been carried away by the wind. But still, the air carried a faint echo of order, a rhythm left behind by the hand that once shaped the empire's pulse. Cyrus had been gone for 1,000 years, and yet the world could not forget him. His empire had broken and reformed 100 times under different names, each successor trying to wear the same mantle. But no one who came after could erase the quiet clarity of what he had built, the idea that law and mercy could dwell together, that a king could wield power without cruelty, that strength could be kind. The tomb stood as the last witness to that dream. Its 6 steps rose from the grass like the base of an altar, its chamber small enough for humility, but strong enough for time. The inscription above its door had faded, but its meaning lived on in every tongue. Travellers came still. Some came from nearby villages, bringing children to see where the shepherd kings slept. Others came from lands so far away that they could not name the mountains they had crossed. They climbed the hill in silence, stood before the small house of stone, and felt themselves grow quiet. The air there always seemed different, lighter, cooler, like breath drawn from another age. Inside, the sunlight filtered through the slit in the roof, just as it had centuries before. Dust motes turned in that single beam of light, rising and falling like spirits returning to the air. Nothing else stirred. Yet for those who entered, the silence carried a strange warmth, as if the king had never truly left, as if his patience lingered in the walls. When empires rose again in the land that had once been Persia, their kings came to the tomb as pilgrims, not conquerors. Darius, the son of another age, stood there in awe, tracing the lines of the inscription and whispering a vow to uphold the order his ancestor had begun. Generals of Macedon, when they arrived centuries later, dismounted at the hill's base and removed their helmets in reverence. One of them, Alexander, ordered the tomb restored when he found it neglected. He placed guards to protect it from plunder and offered gifts of gold and myrrh, not as a conqueror paying tribute to a rival, but as a student honouring a master. He had marched through the same lands, conquered the same cities, dreamed of the same endless unity, and yet even he, at the height of his glory, felt small before the stone simplicity of that house. He was said to have wept there, whispering to his companions, "If I could rule the world as he did, I would die content." The centuries that followed would see kings greater in ambition, but none greater in grace. The world changed beyond recognition. Empires fractured, faiths shifted, languages were born and died. The golden roads of Persia became veins of dust, and the towers of Babylon crumbled into the earth. Yet every empire that rose upon their ruins carried something of Cyrus within it. His vision had become the unseen architecture of civilization, the belief that the rule of law could stand in place of tyranny, that justice could outlive the swords that protected it. In the temples of Greece, they spoke of him as the model of enlightened rule. In the scrolls of Rome, they called him the wise monarch of the East. In the verses of poets from India to Egypt, he was remembered as the bringer of light. Even in lands that had never known his rule, his story travelled like wind-borne pollen, planting seeds in the minds of dreamers who longed for gentler worlds. The tomb weathered storms and silence alike. Rain streaked its limestone face, winds howled across the plains, earthquakes shook its base, but it never fell. When night came, its shadow stretched long and soft across the valley, and the stars gathered above it like the scattered jewels of his crown. Villagers said that the stars above Pasargadae burned brighter than anywhere else on earth. They said the heavens bent closer there, drawn down by memory. On certain nights, when the wind was still, they swore they could hear the faint echo of hooves on the old road, the sound of an invisible procession approaching the tomb. Some said it was his army returning, others that it was the king himself riding the wind, checking that his people still lived in peace. Whether truth or legend, the story endured, and through it he endured. The empire he had once ruled vanished into time's great forgetting, but the empire he had built within the human heart never died. It lived in the laws that shaped nations, in the mercy that stayed the hand of rulers, in the voices of those who believed that justice could be both sword and shield. His words had been carved in clay, but their spirit had taken root in thought. Philosophers centuries later would speak of his decree as the first charter of human freedom. Statesmen in ages beyond imagining would quote his ideals when forming their own. His belief that a man's worth was not his birth, but his conduct became the quiet foundation beneath the chaos of history. Time, which devours all empires, had chosen to spare his. The valley grew older, softer, more golden with each century's passing. The air filled again with birdsong and the hum of bees. The ruins of Pasargadae lay half buried in grass, their stones warm beneath the afternoon sun. The tomb still stood on its hill, solitary, serene, and in the evenings, when the sun sank low and the mountains turned violet, the light of dusk touched the tomb and made it glow. Shepherds returning home would pause to watch it, the children falling silent beside them. For a brief moment, as the world exhaled between day and night, the whole valley seemed to breathe with the pulse of memory. There was no temple, no priest, no ritual, only that faint light, the whisper of the wind, and the sense that somewhere beyond time, the man who had once ruled the known world with compassion still walked unseen among the living. Cyrus the Great, the shepherd of men, the builder of peace, the servant of light, had passed into eternity, but eternity had chosen to remember him.